A philosopher walks into the police headquarters of Paris in 1749, his clothes dishevelled, his mind racing with an idea so dangerous it would reshape the world. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had just read a question posed by the Academy of Dijon. Has the progress of the arts and sciences contributed to the corruption or purification of morals? Most intellectuals would answer with a resounding yes to purification. Rousseau would spend the next hour writing an essay that said the exact opposite, launching a philosophical revolution that would challenge every assumption of his age. But this moment of inspiration reveals something deeper about the man who would become the most paradoxical thinker in Western philosophy. Here was someone willing to argue that human progress was actually human decline, that civilization was barbarism, and that freedom could only be achieved through total submission. Every major idea Rousseau developed contained its own contradiction, yet these contradictions pointed towards truths about human nature that his contemporaries could not see. He was simultaneously the most optimistic and most pessimistic philosopher who ever lived, believing absolutely in human goodness while documenting with ruthless precision how that goodness gets destroyed. Part 1. The State of Nature and the Birth of Inequality. The state of nature is not a place you can visit or a time you can return to. It exists as a philosophical thought experiment designed to strip away everything artificial about human society and discover what lies beneath. Rousseau asked his readers to imagine human beings before agriculture, before language, before property, before government, before religion, before art, before everything that makes up what we call civilization. What would be left? Most philosophers before Rousseau had imagined natural man as either a noble creature fallen from grace or a savage beast controlled by civilization. Thomas Hobbes famously described life in nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short, a war of all against all that made government necessary for survival. John Locke envisioned natural man as basically rational and moral, already possessing the concepts of property and justice that would later form the basis of legitimate government. Rousseau rejected both visions as projections of civilized concepts onto a state where such concepts could not yet exist. Natural man, in Rousseau's analysis, possessed only two fundamental drives: self-preservation and compassion. Self-preservation motivated him to seek food, shelter and safety, but unlike Hobbes's natural man, he felt no need to dominate others or accumulate possessions beyond immediate needs. Compassion, which Rousseau called pity, created an instinctive reluctance to cause unnecessary suffering to other sentient beings. This natural compassion operated below the level of rational reflection, emerging as an immediate emotional response to witnessed pain. The genius of this analysis lies in its psychological realism. Natural man did not need complex moral reasoning because his emotional constitution naturally limited harmful behavior. He did not need elaborate social institutions because his needs were simple and his conflicts with others were minimal. Most importantly, he did not need external authority because his own nature provided sufficient guidance for peaceful coexistence. But natural man also possessed perfectibility, the capacity to adapt his behavior to changing circumstances. This perfectibility distinguished humans from animals who operate according to fixed instincts throughout their lives. A beaver will always build dams in essentially the same way, but humans can modify their techniques, develop new tools, and pass innovations on to their children. Perfectibility made human progress possible, but it also made human corruption inevitable. The transition from nature to civilization began when humans faced environmental challenges that required cooperation to overcome. Perhaps a drought forced scattered individuals to gather around the few remaining water sources. Perhaps climate changes made traditional food sources scarce, requiring new techniques for survival. Whatever the specific cause, humans began living in closer proximity to each other and discovered the advantages of coordinated effort. This cooperation led to the development of language, which Rousseau saw as both humanity's greatest achievement and the beginning of its downfall. Language allowed humans to share knowledge, coordinate complex activities, and develop emotional bonds that transcended immediate physical presence. But language also made possible comparison, judgment, and deception. Once humans could describe their experiences to each other, they inevitably began comparing their situations and competing for relative advantage. The crucial moment in human history occurred when agriculture was invented. Agriculture required permanent settlements, which led to the concept of territory. It rewarded planning and foresight, which led to the accumulation of surplus goods. Most fatally, it created the first clear divisions between those who owned productive land and those who did not. The moment someone could say, "This field is mine," and have others recognize that claim, private property was born, and with it inequality, competition, and all the moral corruption that Rousseau associated with civilized life. This single development divided humanity into rich and poor, powerful and weak, masters and servants. But the corruption went deeper than material inequality. Once humans began comparing themselves to others, natural contentment became impossible. A person with adequate food and shelter could be perfectly happy until they discovered that their neighbor had better food and more comfortable shelter. The development of imagination, which allowed humans to envision possibilities beyond their immediate experience, created artificial needs that could never be satisfied. The emergence of property also corrupted human relationships in fundamental ways. Natural compassion, which had operated freely when humans encountered each other as equals in temporary interactions, was systematically undermined by permanent inequalities of wealth and status. It became increasingly difficult to feel genuine sympathy for those whose suffering was caused by the very system that provided your own advantages. The rich developed elaborate justifications for inequality, while the poor developed resentment and envy that poisoned their capacity for authentic fellow-feeling. Perhaps most perniciously, the development of property created what Rousseau called amour-propre, a form of self-regard based on comparison with others rather than on genuine self-knowledge. Natural man had possessed amour de soi, a healthy concern for his own welfare that operated without reference to others. Civilized man developed amour-propre, a need to be valued by others that could only be satisfied through superiority, recognition, or domination. This shift from internal to external sources of self-worth made authentic happiness impossible because it tied personal satisfaction to the endless and ultimately futile project of gaining advantage over others. The state of nature was not a golden age from which humans had fallen, but rather a condition of innocence from which they had evolved through their own natural capacities. This evolution was not a mistake that could be corrected by returning to primitive conditions. The knowledge, skills and capacities that humans had developed through civilization could not be unlearned, nor would Rousseau want them to be. The challenge was to find a way to preserve the benefits of human development, while recovering the moral clarity and authentic relationships that had been lost in the process. This analysis of human development contained profound implications for how we understand social problems. Crime, war, exploitation, and injustice were not the result of unchangeable human nature, but rather the predictable consequences of social arrangements that pitted people against each other in competitions for artificial goods. Change the social arrangements, and you could change human behavior. But changing social arrangements required understanding how deeply the corruptions of civilization had penetrated human psychology and social relationships. The state of nature thus served as both a critique of existing society and a vision of human potential. It showed that the qualities that make civilized life miserable, qualities like greed, vanity, cruelty and deception, were not natural to humans, but were learned responses to unnatural social conditions. It also showed that humans possessed natural capacities for cooperation, compassion and contentment that could serve as the foundation for better social arrangements. The question was whether these natural capacities could be recovered and channeled through political institutions that worked with human nature rather than against it. Part 2. The Social Contract, From Chains to Freedom. The social contract opens with the most famous sentence in political philosophy: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." But Rousseau immediately follows this with a question that reveals the true radicalism of his project: how did this change come about? Most political theorists had accepted existing governments as natural or inevitable and focused on making them more efficient or just. Rousseau asked whether government itself could be legitimate, and if so, under what conditions. The conventional justification for political authority rested on either divine right or superior force. Kings claimed to rule because God had chosen them, or because they had the power to compel obedience. Rousseau demolished both arguments with devastating precision. Divine right was merely superstition dressed up as theology, while might makes right was a logical contradiction that destroyed the very possibility of moral and political obligation. If force creates right, then the strongest person has the right to rule until someone stronger comes along. But this means that political obligation disappears the moment resistance becomes possible. A government based on force cannot claim that citizens have a duty to obey its laws, only that they will be punished if they disobey. This reduces politics to a war between rulers and ruled, making genuine political community impossible. Rousseau's alternative began with a thought experiment that seemed to make the problem worse rather than better. He asked his readers to imagine a situation where isolated individuals faced threats that none could overcome alone. These individuals needed to combine their forces for mutual protection, but any conventional form of association would require some people to surrender their freedom to others. How could people unite their strength without destroying the very freedom that made their lives worth protecting? The solution required a complete reconceptualization of what freedom means. Natural freedom consisted in doing whatever one wanted, whenever one wanted to do it. But this natural freedom was ultimately illusory, because it was constantly threatened by external forces, and because it provided no protection against the arbitrary will of others. Civil freedom achieved through the social contract transformed arbitrary power into legitimate authority by making every citizen both ruler and ruled simultaneously. The social contract itself involved a total and reciprocal surrender of individual rights to the community as a whole. Each person gave up all natural rights completely, but received back civil rights that were more valuable than what had been surrendered. Natural rights existed only as long as one had the power to enforce them, but civil rights were guaranteed by the collective power of the entire community. More importantly, civil rights carried moral weight that natural rights lacked, transforming mere physical power into legitimate authority. This transformation occurred because the social contract created a new kind of collective being that Rousseau called the sovereign. The sovereign was not a person or group of persons, but rather the community acting as a unified moral agent. When individuals deliberated about public questions as citizens, rather than as private persons pursuing personal interests, they expressed the will of this collective being. The sovereign's will was directed toward the common good because the sovereign, being composed of all citizens equally, could not benefit by harming any part of itself. But the most revolutionary aspect of Rousseau's theory was his claim that obedience to the sovereign actually increased individual freedom rather than limiting it. This paradox becomes comprehensible only when we understand Rousseau's distinction between freedom and license. License means doing whatever you want regardless of consequences to yourself or others. Freedom means acting according to principles that you have chosen for yourself after rational reflection. Citizens who obeyed laws that they had participated in creating were obeying themselves rather than external authorities. They were acting according to their own rational will rather than their immediate impulses or desires. This self-legislation made them free in a way that natural man could never be, because it allowed them to act on principle rather than instinct. The social contract thus accomplished something that seemed impossible. It made people more free by requiring them to obey authority. Yet this freedom came with stringent conditions that Rousseau understood most existing governments could not meet. The social contract required genuine equality among citizens, both political and economic. It required active participation by all citizens in the legislative process, rather than representation by elected officials. It required a small, homogeneous community where citizens could know each other personally and understand the issues they were deciding. Most importantly, it required citizens who were capable of thinking about public questions from a public perspective rather than simply pursuing private interests. This capacity for civic virtue could not be assumed, but had to be cultivated through education and social institutions that supported moral development. Citizens needed to learn to distinguish between their will as private individuals and their will as members of the political community. They needed to develop what Rousseau called the habit of willing the general good. The social contract was therefore not just a political arrangement, but a moral transformation that changed human nature itself. Individuals who entered into the contract ceased to be merely natural beings following instinct and became moral beings capable of acting on principle. They developed new capacities for reason, justice and virtue that would have been impossible in the state of nature. The social contract completed the human developmental process that had begun with the emergence from nature, but completed it in a way that recovered rather than destroyed human goodness. Part 3. The General Will, Democracy's Sacred Mystery. The general will remains the most contested and misunderstood concept in democratic theory. Critics have denounced it as totalitarian mysticism that justifies oppression in the name of popular sovereignty. Supporters have praised it as the only genuine foundation for legitimate democratic government. Both interpretations miss the profound psychological and moral insights that make Rousseau's concept both revolutionary and relevant to contemporary political problems. The general will is not the will of all, which is simply the sum of individual preferences or interests. Nor is it majority rule, which can easily become a form of tyranny when the majority oppresses minority interests. The general will emerges when citizens think about public questions as citizens, rather than as private individuals, when they ask, what would be good for us as a community, rather than, what would be good for me personally? This shift in perspective creates the possibility for discovering shared values and common interests that transcend the particular interests of individuals or groups. Think of a town meeting where citizens are deciding whether to raise taxes to fund a new school. If participants think only about their personal financial interests, homeowners without children will oppose the tax while parents will support it. But if participants think about what would be best for the community as a whole, they might recognize that good schools benefit everyone by attracting young families, supporting property values, and creating a more educated workforce. The general will emerges when citizens transcend their immediate personal interests and identify policies that serve the genuine common good. But this transformation in perspective cannot be achieved through rational argument alone. It requires emotional and psychological changes that affect how people understand themselves and their relationships with others. Citizens must develop what Rousseau called public affections, emotional attachments to the community that are strong enough to motivate sacrifices for the common good. They must learn to take pride in collective achievements rather than only in personal success, and to feel shame when the community fails to live up to its ideals. The general will also depends on structural conditions that make it possible for citizens to identify the common good accurately. Extreme inequality makes this identification impossible because the rich and poor have genuinely conflicting interests that cannot be reconciled through appeals to shared values. When some citizens have vastly more wealth and power than others, their definition of the common good will inevitably reflect their privileged position. The general will can only emerge among citizens who are equal enough to share fundamental interests and concerns. Similarly, the general will require citizens who are well informed about public issues and who have opportunities for genuine deliberation with their fellow citizens. Democracy based on manipulation, propaganda, or emotional appeals cannot produce the rational reflection that the general will requires. Citizens must be able to examine different viewpoints, consider evidence, and modify their opinions based on reasoned discussion. This deliberative process allows the community to discover solutions that satisfy shared values while addressing practical problems effectively. The general will is also indivisible and inalienable, meaning that it cannot be divided among different authorities or transferred to representatives. Citizens cannot delegate their responsibility for making fundamental decisions about the direction of their community. They can elect officials to implement policies or administer programs, but they cannot authorize anyone else to determine what policies should be adopted. The moment citizens stop participating directly in the legislative process, sovereignty passes from the people to their representatives and legitimate government becomes impossible. This requirement for direct participation creates obvious practical problems in large, complex societies. How can millions of citizens engage in the kind of face-to-face deliberation that the general will requires? How can people who know nothing about economics or foreign policy make intelligent decisions about budget priorities or international agreements? Rousseau acknowledged these problems, but insisted that the alternative, government by representatives or experts, inevitably led to the domination of the many by the few. His solution involved limiting the scope of democratic decision-making to fundamental questions about values and principles, while leaving technical implementation to appointed officials. Citizens would decide whether the community should prioritize economic growth or environmental protection, but they would not design specific regulations or choose particular technologies. They would determine whether the community should pursue an aggressive or defensive foreign policy, but they would not negotiate specific treaties or deploy particular military forces. This division between policy and administration would allow citizens to retain control over the direction of their society while leaving specialized tasks to those with appropriate expertise. The general will can also be corrupted by faction, which Rousseau defined as any group that pursues partial interests at the expense of the common good. Political parties, interest groups and social classes all represent forms of faction that make it difficult for citizens to think about public questions from a genuinely public perspective. When citizens identify primarily with their party, profession or social group, they tend to support policies that benefit their faction rather than policies that serve the broader community interest. The general will emerges most clearly when citizens interact as individuals rather than as representatives of organized groups with predetermined agendas. Yet Rousseau also recognized that some forms of association could support rather than undermine the general will. Professional societies, cultural organizations and religious congregations could help citizens develop the social skills and civic virtues necessary for democratic participation. The key was ensuring that no single association became powerful enough to dominate political deliberation while encouraging the proliferation of diverse groups that would prevent any faction from achieving hegemony. A healthy democracy required what later theorists would call a vibrant civil society with multiple overlapping memberships that prevented rigid social divisions. The general will thus represents both a psychological transformation and a political achievement. Psychologically, it requires citizens who can think beyond their immediate self-interest and identify with the welfare of their community. Politically, it requires institutions that promote equality, encourage participation, facilitate deliberation and prevent the concentration of power in the hands of particular individuals or groups. When these psychological and political conditions align, the general will can emerge as a genuine expression of popular sovereignty that makes government both effective and legitimate. Part 4. Sovereignty, government, and the separation of powers. Rousseau drew a crucial distinction between sovereignty and government that fundamentally challenged how political theorists understood the organization of power. Sovereignty belonged exclusively to the people assembled as a collective body, while government was merely the administrative apparatus that implemented sovereign decisions. This distinction meant that no individual or group could ever possess legitimate authority independent of popular consent, and that popular consent could never be permanently transferred to representatives. The people remained sovereign regardless of what form of government they established to carry out their will. Government, in Rousseau's analysis, was nothing more than a commission that the sovereign people granted to particular individuals for the purpose of executing the laws. Like any commission, it could be modified or revoked at any time without the consent of those who held governmental authority. Governors, whether they were called kings, presidents, or prime ministers, were merely public servants who possessed power only as long as the sovereign people chose to grant it to them. They had no independent right to rule and no legitimate claim to obedience except insofar as they faithfully executed the will of the sovereign. This relationship between sovereignty and government created a fundamental tension that Rousseau saw as the central problem of political life. Government was necessary because the sovereign people could not remain in permanent session to handle the day-to-day administration of public affairs. But any government, no matter how democratic its origins, would inevitably develop interests that diverged from those of the sovereign people. Officials would seek to expand their power, extend their terms of office, and use their positions for personal advantage rather than public service. The corruption of government was not a result of personal moral failings, but rather an inevitable consequence of the psychological effects of holding power. People who exercised authority over others would naturally come to see themselves as superior to those they governed. They would develop what Rousseau called the government spirit, a tendency to value the interests of the governmental apparatus over the interests of the people it was supposed to serve. This process of corruption was gradual but inexorable, meaning that eternal vigilance by the sovereign people was necessary to prevent the complete usurpation of legitimate authority. Rousseau analysed three basic forms of government: democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. Democracy, where all citizens participated directly in both legislative and executive functions, was the most legitimate but also the most impractical form of government. It required a small, homogeneous population with simple social arrangements and strong civic virtues. Even under ideal conditions, democratic government was extremely fragile because it placed enormous demands on citizen participation and created constant opportunities for faction and discord. Aristocracy, where a small group of elected officials administered the laws, was more practical for larger societies but created greater risks of corruption. If the aristocrats were chosen based on merit and remained accountable to the sovereign people, aristocratic government could be both efficient and legitimate. But aristocrats would inevitably develop interests separate from those of the general population, and they would use their positions to advance these interests at public expense. The key was ensuring that aristocratic officials remained servants rather than masters of the sovereign people. Monarchy, where a single individual held executive power, was the most efficient form of government, but also the most dangerous. A wise and virtuous monarch could implement the general will more effectively than any collective body, because monarchy avoided the delays and inconsistencies that plagued democratic deliberation. But monarchs were also most likely to confuse their personal will with the general will and to use governmental power for private rather than public purposes. The concentration of executive authority in a single person created maximum efficiency but also maximum risk of tyranny. The choice among these forms of government should depend on the size, geography, and social conditions of the particular society in question. Small, simple societies could successfully employ democratic government because the administrative tasks were manageable and citizens could participate meaningfully in executive decisions. Large, complex societies required some form of aristocratic or monarchical government because the scope of administrative responsibilities exceeded what democratic assemblies could handle effectively. But regardless of which form of government was chosen, the fundamental principle remained the same. Government was always subordinate to sovereignty, and sovereignty always belonged to the people. Rousseau rejected the conventional doctrine of separation of powers that divided governmental authority among different branches or institutions. Legislative, executive, and judicial functions might be assigned to different officials for practical reasons, but this division did not create independent centres of authority that could check and balance each other. All governmental power derived from the sovereign people, and all governmental officials were equally subordinate to popular authority. The separation of powers created the illusion of limited government while actually making it easier for governmental officials to escape popular accountability. Instead of institutional checks and balances, Rousseau proposed periodic assemblies where the sovereign people would review the performance of their governmental agents and decide whether to continue or modify their commissions. These assemblies would begin by addressing two fundamental questions. First, whether the people wished to maintain the present form of government, and second, whether they wished to retain the current holders of governmental authority. Only after affirming both the governmental structure and the particular officials would the Assembly proceed to consider specific policy questions. This procedure ensured that governmental power never became independent of popular consent and that officials never forgot their subordinate status. The relationship between sovereignty and government also had implications for how citizens should understand their political obligations. Citizens owed obedience to legitimate governmental authority, but only insofar as that authority faithfully executed the general will. When government departed from its proper function and began pursuing particular interests rather than the common good, citizens had not only the right but the duty to resist. This resistance might take the form of electoral opposition, civil disobedience, or even revolution, depending on the severity of governmental corruption and the availability of peaceful remedies. But Rousseau warned that the distinction between legitimate resistance and factious rebellion was often difficult to determine in practice. Citizens who opposed government policies might claim to be defending the general will when they were actually pursuing their own particular interests. Government officials might claim to be serving the common good when they were actually advancing their own power and privilege. The only reliable safeguard against these confusions was the cultivation of civic virtue among citizens and the maintenance of institutional arrangements that promoted genuine deliberation about the public interest. Part 5. Natural Education. The Emile Revolution. Emile represents the most systematic critique of education ever written, challenging every assumption about how human beings learn and develop. Rousseau began with a simple but revolutionary premise. Children are naturally good and naturally capable of learning what they need to know. The problem with traditional education was not that it failed to teach enough, but that it taught too much, too early, destroying natural curiosity and replacing authentic development with artificial conformity. Everything that children learned through conventional schooling made them less capable of thinking for themselves and more dependent on external authority for guidance. The educational process that Rousseau outlined for his fictional student followed the natural stages of human development rather than an imposed curriculum designed by adults. From birth to age 5, Emile would learn through direct physical interaction with his environment, developing strength, coordination, and sensory awareness without formal instruction. From 5 to 12, he would continue learning through observation and experiment, discovering the basic principles of physics, mathematics, and logic through hands-on experience, rather than through books and lectures. Only after 12 would he begin formal academic study, and then only because he had developed the intellectual maturity to understand why such study might be useful. This approach required a complete reversal of conventional educational priorities. Instead of teaching children to read as early as possible, Rousseau insisted that reading should be delayed until children had real reasons for wanting to access written information. Instead of filling young minds with facts and rules, education should focus on developing the capacity for observation, experimentation, and independent reasoning. Instead of rewarding obedience and conformity, education should encourage curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking. The psychological insights underlying this educational philosophy were far ahead of their time. Rousseau understood that children learn most effectively when they are internally motivated rather than externally coerced. He recognized that different children develop at different rates, and that forcing all children through the same sequence of lessons at the same pace would inevitably frustrate some while boring others. Most importantly, he saw that conventional education was creating adults who were incapable of independent moral judgment because they had never learned to think for themselves. The first stage of education focused on physical development and sensory training. Emile would be encouraged to run, climb, swim and engage in vigorous physical activity that would strengthen his body and sharpen his senses. He would learn to endure discomfort, overcome fear, and adapt to changing circumstances through direct experience rather than through verbal instruction. This physical education was not separate from intellectual development, but rather its necessary foundation because clear thinking required a healthy body and acute sensory awareness. During this early stage, Emile would also learn the fundamental distinction between necessity and arbitrary human conventions. When he encountered natural obstacles like walls or rivers, he would learn to adapt his behavior to unchangeable realities. But he would never be required to obey rules that existed merely because adults had decided to impose them. This distinction between natural necessity and human authority was crucial for developing the capacity for independent moral reasoning that democratic citizenship would later require. The second stage of education introduced intellectual development through practical problem-solving rather than abstract study. Emile would learn mathematics by measuring and building, astronomy by navigation, geography by travel, and physics by constructing mechanical devices. Each subject would be mastered only when Emile encountered real situations, where that knowledge would help him achieve something he genuinely wanted to accomplish. This approach ensured that learning was always connected to practical application rather than divorced from lived experience. Crucially, Emile would learn to rely on his own observation and reasoning rather than on the authority of books or teachers. When he wanted to understand how a machine worked, he would take it apart and reassemble it, rather than reading explanations written by others. When he needed to solve a mathematical problem, he would work through the solution himself, rather than memorizing formulas that others had discovered. This approach was slower and more difficult than conventional instruction, but it produced genuine understanding rather than superficial knowledge. The social dimension of education was equally revolutionary. Emile would interact with people from all social classes and occupations, learning to value individuals based on their character and abilities rather than their wealth or status. He would master a practical trade that would allow him to support himself through honest labour regardless of changes in his social circumstances. Most importantly, he would learn to form relationships based on mutual respect and affection rather than on domination and submission. Rousseau insisted that moral education could not be accomplished through preaching or rule-following, but only through the development of natural sympathy and rational reflection. Emile would learn to consider the consequences of his actions for others by observing those consequences directly rather than by being told what was right and wrong. He would develop the capacity for moral reasoning by thinking through ethical dilemmas for himself rather than by memorizing moral precepts formulated by others. This approach produced moral autonomy rather than moral dependence, creating citizens capable of participating in the general will rather than subjects who simply obeyed external authority. The religious dimension of Emile's education reflected Rousseau's conviction that natural religion was superior to revealed religion. Emile would develop reverence for the Creator by contemplating the beauty and order of the natural world rather than by studying theological doctrines. He would learn to distinguish between essential religious truths that reason could discover and particular religious claims that depended on historical tradition. This natural religion would provide moral guidance and spiritual comfort without creating the dogmatism and intolerance that characterized conventional religious education. The ultimate goal of this educational process was to produce what Rousseau called the natural man living in society. Emile would possess the self-reliance and moral clarity of natural man combined with the knowledge and social skills necessary for civilized life. He would be capable of independent thought and action, but also able to cooperate effectively with others in pursuit of common goals. Most importantly, he would retain the natural goodness and authentic feeling that conventional education systematically destroyed, making him capable of genuine relationships and moral commitment. Part 6. Religion, Civil Religion, and the Sacred Foundations of Society. Rousseau's analysis of religion revealed the same fundamental tension that characterized all his social thinking. The institutions that human beings created to serve their needs inevitably ended up corrupting and enslaving them. Traditional religion had begun as a natural human response to the mystery and beauty of existence, but it had evolved into an elaborate system of superstition and priestly power that undermined rather than supported genuine spiritual development. Yet purely secular society posed equally serious dangers, because human beings needed some sense of the sacred to motivate the moral commitments that social life required. The challenge was to preserve the benefits of religious sentiment while eliminating the harmful effects of religious institutions. The profession of faith of a Savoyard vicar, presented in the fourth book of Emile, outlined Rousseau's vision of natural religion based on reason and sentiment rather than revelation and authority. This natural religion began with the immediate conviction of personal existence and the evidence of the senses, proceeding through careful reasoning to conclusions about the nature of reality and human obligation. The vicar argued that the order and beauty evident in the natural world pointed towards an intelligent creator, that the human capacity for moral choice implied free will and moral responsibility, and that justice required some form of afterlife where virtue would be rewarded and vice punished. These simple beliefs provided sufficient foundation for moral life without requiring acceptance of particular historical claims or submission to ecclesiastical authority. But Rousseau understood that individual religious belief, however rational and sincere, could not by itself solve the political problem that religion created. Traditional Christianity, with its emphasis on otherworldly salvation and universal brotherhood, was fundamentally incompatible with the civic virtue that legitimate government required. Christians were taught to be citizens of heaven rather than of their earthly communities, to turn the other cheek rather than defend their political rights, and to obey earthly authorities regardless of whether those authorities served the common good. A society composed entirely of sincere Christians would be incapable of defending itself against external enemies or internal corruption. The historical development of Christianity had only made these problems worse. What had begun as a simple message of love and salvation had evolved into an elaborate institutional apparatus that competed with civil government for the loyalty of citizens. The Catholic Church claimed authority over marriage, education and moral conduct that properly belonged to civil society, while Protestant churches fragmented communities into competing sects that could not agree on fundamental questions of belief and practice. Religious diversity, which liberal theorists praised as a source of freedom and creativity, actually undermined the social unity that legitimate government required. Rousseau's solution was civil religion, a set of simple beliefs that would unite citizens without requiring them to accept complex theological doctrines or submit to religious authorities. Civil religion would affirm the existence of a beneficent deity, the immortality of the soul, the ultimate triumph of justice, and the sanctity of the social contract and the laws. It would reject intolerance as the greatest of political vices while maintaining silence on theological questions that could not be resolved through reason and that had no bearing on civic obligation. Citizens could maintain their private religious beliefs as long as those beliefs did not contradict the simple tenets of civil religion or undermine their commitment to the common good. The enforcement of civil religion would be minimal but decisive. Citizens would not be required to believe its doctrines sincerely, only to acknowledge them publicly and to behave as if they believed them. Those who refused this public acknowledgement would be banished from the community, not as impious, but as antisocial beings incapable of genuine commitment to the common good. Those who publicly affirmed civil religion but violated its principles through their conduct would be punished more severely than ordinary criminals, because they would have committed the crime of lying before the sovereign people. This proposal reflected Rousseau's deep understanding of the psychological foundations of political commitment. Human beings needed to believe that their political obligations had ultimate significance, that violating the social contract was not merely imprudent but actually wrong in some absolute sense. Purely rational arguments for civic duty were insufficient to motivate the sacrifices that citizenship sometimes required, especially when those sacrifices conflicted with immediate self-interest. Civil religion provided the emotional and spiritual support that rational commitment to the common good required without creating the divisive theological disputes that undermined social unity. The content of civil religion was deliberately minimal because Rousseau recognized that theological complexity inevitably led to theological controversy. As soon as religious doctrines went beyond what reason could establish with certainty, they became matters of opinion rather than knowledge, creating opportunities for disagreement and conflict. The more elaborate and detailed religious systems became, the more likely they were to fragment into competing sects that placed sectarian loyalty above civic obligation. Civil religion avoided these problems by limiting itself to beliefs that were both rationally defensible and politically necessary. Yet Rousseau also understood that civil religion could not completely replace traditional religion for most people. The simple beliefs of civil religion, while sufficient for political purposes, could not satisfy the deeper spiritual needs that drove human beings to seek meaning and transcendence. Private religion would continue to flourish alongside civil religion, providing individuals with the theological elaboration and ritual practice that civil religion deliberately avoided. The key was ensuring that private religious commitments supported rather than undermined the civic virtues that legitimate government required. The relationship between civil and private religion revealed another dimension of Rousseau's analysis of the tension between individual development and social obligation. Individuals needed the freedom to pursue spiritual truth according to their own understanding and experience. But societies needed shared beliefs that could motivate collective action in pursuit of the common good. Civil religion represented a compromise that preserved individual spiritual freedom while ensuring sufficient social unity for legitimate government to function. But like all of Rousseau's solutions to the problems of social life, this compromise required constant vigilance to prevent it from degenerating into either sectarian conflict or secular tyranny. The practical implementation of civil religion also raised difficult questions about the boundaries of toleration and the legitimate use of governmental power. How could public authorities distinguish between religious beliefs that supported civic virtue and those that undermined it? How could they prevent civil religion from becoming another form of political oppression disguised as spiritual guidance? Rousseau's analysis pointed towards these problems without providing definitive solutions, reflecting his recognition that the tension between spiritual freedom and social unity could be managed but never completely resolved. Part 7. The Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, the First Critique of Progress. The essay that launched Rousseau's philosophical career posed a question that seemed to have an obvious answer. Has the progress of the arts and sciences contributed to the corruption or purification of morals? Every enlightened person in 18th century Europe knew that knowledge, refinement and cultural sophistication made people more virtuous, more rational and more humane. Rousseau's answer demolished this comfortable assumption with arguments so radical that they still challenge our basic beliefs about education, progress and civilization. He argued that the arts and sciences had not only failed to improve human morality, but had actively corrupted it, creating new forms of inequality, deception and spiritual emptiness that made authentic human relationships impossible. The corruption began with the very process of intellectual development itself. As human beings acquired knowledge and refined their cultural expressions, they inevitably began to compare their achievements with those of others. This comparison created competition for intellectual and artistic recognition that replaced the natural contentment that had characterized simpler societies. Scholars competed for academic honors, artists competed for patronage and fame, and entire nations competed for cultural supremacy in ways that had nothing to do with genuine human welfare. The arts and sciences also created new forms of social hierarchy based on intellectual rather than physical superiority. In simple societies, differences in strength, skill or courage created temporary advantages that rarely led to permanent inequality. But intellectual and cultural achievements could be accumulated, transmitted to descendants, and used to justify lasting social distinctions between the educated elite and the ignorant masses. The development of literacy, in particular, created an unbridgeable gap between those who could read and write and those who could not, establishing new forms of domination that were more subtle but no less effective than physical force. Perhaps most perniciously, the cultivation of the arts and sciences taught people to value appearance over reality and to prize verbal facility over genuine virtue. Educated people learned to say what others wanted to hear rather than what they actually believed, to manipulate through eloquence rather than to persuade through reason, and to pursue social recognition rather than moral excellence. The very refinement that was supposed to make people more civilized actually made them more deceptive, because it provided sophisticated tools for concealing base motives behind elegant expressions. Politeness became a mask for contempt, courtesy became a strategy for exploitation, and intellectual discourse became a game where winning mattered more than discovering truth. Rousseau supported his argument with historical examples that showed the inverse relationship between cultural achievement and moral virtue. Ancient Sparta, which deliberately rejected luxury and intellectual sophistication, produced citizens of legendary virtue and patriotism who preferred death to dishonor. Ancient Athens, despite its philosophical schools and artistic masterpieces, was corrupted by vanity, factionalism, and imperial ambition that ultimately led to its destruction. Rome conquered the world when its citizens were simple farmers and soldiers, but lost its empire when they became connoisseurs of Greek philosophy and Eastern luxury. Even more telling was the contrast between great thinkers and virtuous individuals. Many of the most celebrated philosophers and scientists were personally vicious, while many of the most virtuous people were simple, uneducated individuals who followed their natural moral sentiments rather than sophisticated ethical theories. Intellectual brilliance and moral excellence seemed to be not merely independent but actually incompatible, because the pride and competitiveness that intellectual achievement required were fundamentally opposed to the humility and compassion that virtue demanded. The pursuit of knowledge for its own sake was a form of intellectual vanity that distracted attention from the practical moral obligations that constituted the real business of human life. The social effects of intellectual and artistic development were equally harmful. The arts and sciences required leisure for their cultivation, which meant that they could only flourish in societies with sufficient wealth to support a non-productive class of scholars and artists. This wealth was inevitably extracted from the labour of workers who had no opportunity to participate in cultural refinement, creating a permanent division between those who thought and those who worked. The very existence of intellectual and artistic elites depended on the exploitation of manual labourers who were condemned to ignorance and drudgery so that others could pursue higher forms of cultural development. The consumption of cultural products created additional forms of corruption among both elites and masses. Wealthy patrons supported artists and scholars not from genuine appreciation of truth and beauty, but from vanity and the desire for social distinction. They wanted to be seen as cultured and sophisticated rather than to actually engage with challenging ideas or profound artistic expressions. This reduced art and scholarship to luxury commodities designed to flatter the prejudices of those who could afford to purchase them, corrupting both producers and consumers in the process. The educational system that transmitted cultural knowledge from one generation to the next reinforced rather than challenged these corrupting tendencies. Schools taught children to compete for academic honours rather than to cooperate in the pursuit of truth, to memorize the opinions of authorities rather than to think independently, and to value verbal cleverness over practical wisdom. Students learn to see education as a ladder to social advancement rather than as preparation for virtue and citizenship. The very institutions that were supposed to enlighten and improve human beings actually made them more competitive, more artificial, and more alienated from their natural moral sentiments. Rousseau's critique extended to the content as well as the social context of intellectual and artistic development. Much of what passed for knowledge was actually elaborate speculation about matters that had no bearing on how people should live their lives. Philosophers constructed abstract systems that satisfied their intellectual vanity but provided no practical guidance for moral conduct. Scientists investigated natural phenomena with impressive precision but ignored the moral and social consequences of their discoveries. Artists created works of stunning technical virtuosity that celebrated vice and corruption as enthusiastically as virtue and nobility. The pursuit of knowledge and beauty had become divorced from the pursuit of wisdom and goodness, creating a culture that was intellectually sophisticated but morally bankrupt. Yet, Rousseau was not advocating a return to ignorance or barbarism. He recognized that the arts and sciences, despite their corrupting effects, had also produced genuine insights and created real beauty that enriched human experience. The problem was not knowledge itself, but the social context in which knowledge was pursued and the purposes for which it was used. In a just society populated by virtuous citizens, intellectual and artistic development could contribute to human flourishing rather than human corruption, but only if it remained subordinate to moral and political goals rather than becoming an end in itself. Part 8. Economic Philosophy, Property, Inequality, and the Corruption of Exchange. Rousseau's economic thinking began with the recognition that private property was the root of all social inequality and most forms of human misery. But unlike later socialist critics of capitalism, he did not advocate the abolition of property rights or the establishment of collective ownership. Instead, he sought to understand how property had developed historically, why it had such destructive social effects, and whether it might be possible to organize economic life in ways that preserved the benefits of individual ownership while minimizing its corrupting influence. His analysis revealed fundamental contradictions in economic development that anticipated many of the problems that would plague industrial society. The development of property began when humans emerged from the pure state of nature and began living in closer proximity to each other. Initially, this association was beneficial because it allowed people to cooperate in ways that increased their security and comfort without creating permanent inequalities. But the invention of agriculture changed everything by making it possible for individuals to claim exclusive control over productive resources. The moment someone could say, "This field is mine," and have others recognize that claim, society was divided into those who owned productive property and those who did not. This division was not initially based on differences in merit, talent, or effort. The first property owners were simply those who happened to be in the right place at the right time when agricultural techniques were developed and land claims were being established. But once some people owned productive resources while others owned nothing, economic relationships inevitably became relationships of domination and subordination. Property owners could dictate terms to non-owners because they controlled access to the means of survival, creating a permanent class of dependent labourers who had to accept whatever conditions property owners chose to impose. The psychological effects of property ownership were as destructive as the social effects. Property created artificial needs that could never be satisfied because they were based on comparison with others rather than on genuine human requirements. A person with adequate food, shelter and clothing could be perfectly content until they discovered that their neighbour had better food, more comfortable shelter and finer clothing. The development of imagination, which allowed people to envision possibilities beyond their immediate experience, created an endless cycle of desire for more and better possessions that made natural contentment impossible. Property also corrupted human relationships by making it profitable for people to deceive and exploit each other. In the state of nature, there had been no advantage in lying or cheating because people had few permanent relationships and little to gain from temporary deceptions. But once valuable possessions could be accumulated and transferred, dishonesty became a pathway to wealth and status. Property owners had incentives to misrepresent the value of their goods, to break their promises when convenient, and to use their economic power to extract unfair advantages from those who depended on them. The development of money made these problems even worse by creating a universal medium of exchange that could be accumulated without limit. In simple societies based on barter, people could only accumulate as many goods as they could actually use or store. But money could be accumulated indefinitely, creating the possibility for some individuals to amass wealth far beyond any conceivable personal need. The pursuit of money for its own sake became an end in itself, divorced from any genuine human purpose and destructive of the social relationships that gave life meaning. Money also made possible new forms of economic exploitation that were more subtle but no less effective than direct physical coercion. Wealthy individuals could lend money at interest, creating permanent relationships of indebtedness that gave them control over borrowers without requiring ongoing supervision or management. They could invest in productive enterprises without participating in actual production, extracting profits from the labour of others while contributing nothing themselves to the creation of value. Most perniciously, They could manipulate markets by withholding goods from sale when prices were low, or flooding markets when prices were high, creating artificial scarcities and abundances that served their interests rather than genuine social needs. The emergence of commercial society created what Rousseau saw as a fundamental contradiction between individual rationality and collective welfare. Each individual acting rationally in pursuit of personal economic advantage contributed to outcomes that made everyone worse off than they would have been under different economic arrangements. Competition for profits led to the overproduction of luxury goods and the underproduction of necessities, to the degradation of working conditions and the pollution of the environment, and to economic instability that periodically destroyed the wealth that competition was supposed to create. The invisible hand of the market, which liberal economists praised as a mechanism for harmonizing individual and social interests, actually created conflicts between individual and social welfare that could not be resolved through market mechanisms alone. Rousseau's solution involved limiting, rather than abolishing, private property rights. He argued that legitimate property ownership should be restricted to what individuals could actually use productively without employing the labour of others. This would prevent the accumulation of vast estates that served no purpose except to generate unearned income for their owners while reducing others to economic dependence. It would also ensure that property ownership remained widely distributed rather than concentrated in the hands of a few individuals who could use their economic power to dominate political institutions. The regulation of property would need to be accompanied by laws that prevented extreme inequality from developing even within these limits. Progressive taxation could ensure that no individual accumulated wealth far beyond what others possessed, while inheritance laws could prevent the transmission of large fortunes from one generation to the next. Public works projects could provide employment for those who lacked productive property, while public education could ensure that all citizens had opportunities to develop their talents regardless of their economic circumstances. The goal was not equality of outcomes, which Rousseau saw as both impossible and undesirable, but rather equality of opportunity and the prevention of extremes that would undermine social unity and political freedom. Perhaps most importantly, economic policy should be subordinated to moral and political goals rather than treated as an independent sphere governed by its own laws. The purpose of economic activity was to provide the material foundation for human flourishing, not to maximize the accumulation of wealth for its own sake. Economic arrangements should support the development of virtue and citizenship rather than encouraging the competitive individualism that made both virtue and citizenship impossible. This meant that economic efficiency, while important, should never be purchased at the cost of social justice or political freedom, and that the distribution of wealth should reflect moral and political principles rather than the accidents of market competition. Part 9. Gender, Family and the Sophie Problem. Rousseau's analysis of gender and family relationships revealed the same fundamental tension that characterized all his social thinking, but in a particularly acute form. He argued that natural differences between men and women require different forms of education and different social roles. But these differences had been distorted by civilization in ways that corrupted both sexes and undermined authentic relationships between them. His portrait of Sophie, the ideal woman who was to become Emile's companion, reflected both progressive insights about the importance of education for women and deeply conservative assumptions about women's natural capacities and social functions. This combination has made Rousseau's writings on gender among the most controversial aspects of his philosophy. The foundation of Rousseau's analysis was his conviction that men and women were naturally different in ways that complemented each other, rather than creating hierarchies of superiority and inferiority. Men were naturally stronger, more aggressive, and more suited for activities that required physical courage and rational analysis. Women were naturally more sensitive, more intuitive, and more capable of understanding the emotional and social dimensions of human experience. These differences meant that men and women had different natural capacities and different social functions, but it did not mean that one sex was superior to the other in any absolute sense. The problem was that civilization had corrupted these natural differences in ways that degraded both sexes. Men had been taught to use their superior physical strength to dominate women rather than to protect and support them. Women had been taught to use their emotional and social intelligence to manipulate men rather than to guide and inspire them. Both sexes had learned to compete with members of their own sex for social recognition rather than to cooperate in pursuit of common goals. The education of women in civilized society was particularly destructive because it prepared them for artificial rather than natural roles. Upper-class women were taught to be ornamental rather than useful, to focus on appearance rather than character, and to value social success rather than domestic happiness. They learned to see marriage as a business transaction rather than as an emotional and spiritual partnership, and to view their children as accessories to their social status rather than as human beings deserving love and guidance. This artificial education made women incapable of fulfilling their natural functions as wives and mothers, while providing them with no genuine alternative sources of satisfaction and meaning. Working-class women faced different but equally serious problems. Economic necessity forced them to work outside the home in conditions that undermined their health and prevented them from caring properly for their children. They were exploited by employers who paid them less than men for the same work, and by husbands who expected them to contribute financially while still maintaining primary responsibility for domestic duties. The economic pressures of civilized life thus prevented working-class women from fulfilling their natural roles while providing them with none of the compensating advantages that education and leisure might have offered. Rousseau's educational program for Sophie was designed to prepare her for what he saw as women's natural role as wives and mothers, while avoiding the corruptions that characterized conventional female education. Sophie would be educated to be useful rather than ornamental, to value character over appearance, and to find satisfaction in domestic life rather than in social recognition. She would learn practical skills like cooking, sewing, and household management. But she would also develop her intellectual and aesthetic capacities through reading, music, and art. Most importantly, she would learn to understand and guide the emotional development of children, making her capable of serving as the primary educator during the crucial early years of human development. But Sophie's education would differ from Emile's in fundamental ways that reflected Rousseau's assumptions about natural gender differences. While Emile learned through direct experimentation and independent reasoning, Sophie would learn through observation and intuition, guided by trusted authorities. While Emile was encouraged to question conventional beliefs and develop his own moral principles, Sophie would be taught to accept and transmit traditional values that had proven their worth over time. While Emile was prepared for active citizenship in the public sphere, Sophie was prepared for influence in the private sphere of family and social relationships. This division of labour between public and private spheres was central to Rousseau's vision of how gender relationships could support, rather than undermine, social virtue. Men would handle the competitive and potentially corrupting activities of economic and political life, while women would maintain the moral and emotional foundations that made virtue possible. The family would serve as a refuge from the artificiality and corruption of public life, providing men with the emotional support and moral guidance they needed to resist the corrupting influences of civilization. Women would exercise power indirectly through their influence on husbands and children rather than directly through participation in political institutions. The marriage relationship itself was conceived as a partnership based on mutual dependence rather than equality or domination. Husbands would depend on wives for emotional support, moral guidance, and the management of domestic affairs, while wives would depend on husbands for economic support, physical protection, and connection to the larger world beyond the family. This interdependence would create bonds of affection and loyalty that were stronger than either legal contracts or economic arrangements, because each partner would have something essential to offer that the other could not provide for themselves. The relationship would be based on love and mutual respect rather than on conquest and submission. Rousseau also emphasized the importance of maternal influence in the education of young children. During the crucial early years when character was being formed, children needed the constant attention and emotional responsiveness that only mothers could provide. Fathers could contribute to child-rearing, especially during later stages when intellectual development became more important. But they could not replace the intimate emotional bond between mother and child that was essential for healthy psychological development. This meant that society had a vital interest in ensuring that women were properly educated for their maternal responsibilities and that economic arrangements allowed them to focus on child-rearing rather than forcing them into outside employment. Yet Rousseau's analysis also contained implicit critiques of conventional gender arrangements that pointed toward more egalitarian possibilities. His emphasis on education for women challenged the widespread belief that women were naturally inferior in intellectual capacity and incapable of rational thought. His recognition of women's moral and emotional intelligence suggested that their contributions to society were as valuable as men's, even if they took different forms. His critique of artificial social distinctions implied that many of the differences between men and women were cultural rather than natural, and could therefore be modified through changes in education and social arrangements. The tension between these progressive and conservative elements in Rousseau's thinking about gender reflected the broader contradictions in his philosophy. He wanted to preserve what was valuable in traditional relationships while eliminating what was corrupting in contemporary social arrangements. He sought to base social institutions on natural foundations while recognizing that nature itself had been distorted by the historical development of civilization. His vision of gender relationships, like his vision of political relationships, pointed toward possibilities that were both more natural and more artificial than what existed in his own time, requiring both a return to authentic human nature and a deliberate reconstruction of social institutions. Part 10. Political Psychology, the Transformation of Human Nature. The deepest insight in Rousseau's political philosophy was his recognition that legitimate government required not just new institutions, but a fundamental transformation in human psychology. Citizens capable of participating in the general will needed to develop capacities for moral reasoning, emotional identification with the community, and voluntary self-restraint that were foreign to both natural man and civilized man as he actually existed. This transformation could not be accomplished through rational argument alone, but required a complete reconstruction of the social environment in which human development took place. Rousseau was thus not only a political theorist, but also a social psychologist who understood that changing political arrangements required changing the human beings who would operate those arrangements. The psychological transformation required by legitimate government involved three fundamental changes in how individuals understood themselves and their relationships with others. First, people needed to develop the capacity to think about public questions from a public perspective rather than simply pursuing their private interests. This meant learning to ask what would be good for us as a community, rather than what would be good for me personally, and being willing to sacrifice immediate personal advantage for the sake of long-term collective benefit. Second, people needed to develop emotional attachments to the community that were strong enough to motivate the sacrifices that citizenship sometimes required. Third, and most importantly, people needed to internalize the authority of the general will so completely that obedience to legitimate law felt like freedom rather than constraint. This internalization required a fundamental shift from external to internal sources of moral authority, from obedience based on fear of punishment to obedience based on recognition of rightness. Citizens who had undergone this transformation would experience genuine inner conflict when they were tempted to violate the law, not because they feared getting caught, but because law-breaking violated their own deepest values and commitments. They would have become what Rousseau called moral beings, rather than merely natural beings, capable of acting on principle rather than instinct. This psychological transformation could not be accomplished simply by explaining to people why they should behave differently. Human psychology was shaped by the entire social environment in which development took place, including family relationships, educational experiences, economic arrangements, and cultural institutions. Changing political behavior required changing all of these environmental factors in ways that supported rather than undermined the development of civic virtue. This was why Rousseau's political theory was so intimately connected with his theories of education, economics, religion, and family life. All of these apparently separate spheres needed to be coordinated in support of the common goal of creating citizens capable of legitimate self-government. The process of psychological transformation was particularly difficult because it required overcoming the corrupting effects of existing social arrangements. People who had grown up in societies based on inequality, competition and deception had learned to see the world through the lens of amour propre, constantly comparing themselves with others and seeking advantage through manipulation and domination. They had internalized the values and assumptions of civilized society so deeply that they experienced these artificial needs and desires as natural and inevitable. Transforming such people into citizens required not just new learning but unlearning, not just developing new capacities but overcoming deeply ingrained habits of thought and feeling. The role of legislation in this transformation process was paradoxical. Laws could not directly create virtue because virtue had to emerge from internal conviction rather than external compulsion. But laws could create social conditions that made virtue more likely to develop by removing temptations to vice and providing incentives for virtuous behavior. Good laws were like good educational practices. They worked with natural human tendencies rather than against them, making it easier for people to do what they knew they should do and harder for them to do what they knew they should not do. The most important function of legislation was to prevent the development of extreme inequalities that would make it impossible for citizens to identify with each other's welfare. When some people had vastly more wealth and power than others, they inevitably developed different interests that could not be reconciled. through appeals to the common good. The rich would define the common good in ways that preserved their advantages, while the poor would see the common good as requiring the redistribution of wealth and power. Under such conditions, the general will could not emerge because there was no genuine community of interest that could serve as its foundation. Legislation also needed to support the development of what Rousseau called public affections, emotional attachments to the community that were strong enough to compete with private attachments to family, friends, and personal interests. This could be accomplished through public festivals, civic ceremonies, and shared rituals that created opportunities for citizens to experience themselves as members of a larger whole. It could also be supported through educational practices that emphasized civic responsibility and through economic arrangements that made individual welfare depend on collective welfare. The goal was to create psychological identification with the community that was as strong as the identification that people naturally felt with their immediate families. The transformation of human psychology also required what Rousseau called the legislator, a figure who could design institutions and practices that would gradually reshape human nature in the direction of civic virtue. The legislator could not be an ordinary political leader because the changes required went too deep to be accomplished through normal political processes. Nor could the legislator be a permanent ruler, because the whole point was to create citizens capable of governing themselves rather than subjects dependent on external authority. The legislator was more like an educator or therapist who worked to create conditions under which people could develop capacities they did not yet possess but would need for self-governance. The psychological dimension of Rousseau's political theory also explained why he was so pessimistic about the possibility of political reform in existing societies. The corruptions of civilization had penetrated so deeply into human psychology that they could not be corrected through superficial, institutional changes. People who had learned to value competition over cooperation, appearance over reality, and individual advantage over collective welfare could not suddenly be transformed into virtuous citizens simply by changing the laws under which they lived. Real political reform required starting over with new people who had been educated from childhood for citizenship rather than for the competitive individualism that characterized existing societies. Yet Rousseau also believed that human nature was sufficiently plastic that such transformation was possible under the right conditions. The same perfectibility that had allowed humans to develop from natural innocence through civilized corruption could also allow them to evolve toward a new form of social existence that combined the moral clarity of nature with the knowledge and capabilities of civilization. The challenge was creating social institutions that would channel human perfectibility in constructive rather than destructive directions, supporting the development of capacities for reason, virtue, and authentic relationship that would make legitimate self-government possible. This was the ultimate goal of all of Rousseau's political, educational, and social reforms, the creation of human beings who were capable of freedom in the fullest sense of that term. Part 11. The Confessions, Autobiography as Philosophy. The Confessions represents one of the most revolutionary documents in the history of literature and philosophy, not simply because of its unprecedented honesty about intimate personal details, but because Rousseau used his own life story as a laboratory for testing his theories about human nature and social development. He began with a startling claim. "I am commencing an undertaking, hitherto without precedent, and which will never find an imitator." This was not mere vanity, but a recognition that he was creating a new form of philosophical inquiry that used rigorous self-examination to illuminate universal truths about human psychology and social relationships. The Confessions was simultaneously the most personal and most impersonal book ever written, revealing intimate secrets in order to demonstrate how individual development reflected larger social and historical processes. Rousseau's method in the Confessions was based on his conviction that human beings could only understand themselves by tracing their development from earliest childhood through all the stages of their moral and intellectual growth. He rejected the philosophical tradition that tried to understand human nature through abstract reasoning about universal principles, arguing instead that such understanding could only emerge from careful observation of how particular individuals actually developed under specific historical and social conditions. His own life provided the perfect case study, because he had experienced both the corruptions of civilized society and moments of authentic feeling that revealed what human nature could become under better circumstances. By examining his own psychological development with ruthless honesty, he could discover patterns that applied to human development more generally. The narrative structure of the Confessions revealed Rousseau's understanding of how social environment shaped individual psychology. His early childhood in Geneva, before he was exposed to the corruptions of aristocratic society, showed the natural goodness and authenticity that characterized human beings in their original state. His adolescent experiences as an apprentice and servant demonstrated how social inequality and harsh treatment could corrupt natural sentiment and create the resentment and deception that characterized civilized relationships. His later involvement with Parisian intellectual society illustrated how even well-intentioned efforts at self-improvement could become sources of vanity and artificiality when pursued in competitive social environments. Perhaps most importantly, Rousseau used his autobiography to demonstrate the possibility of moral regeneration through authentic self-examination and withdrawal from corrupting social influences. His famous conversion experience on the road to Vincennes, when he first conceived the ideas that would make him famous, showed how genuine insight could emerge from solitary reflection rather than from social interaction or scholarly research. His subsequent decision to reform his own life by simplifying his needs, refusing social honours, and dedicating himself to truth rather than success illustrated how individuals could resist the corrupting influences of civilization through acts of conscious moral choice. The Confessions thus served as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of social life and an inspiring example of how authentic individuals could maintain their integrity despite social pressures. The sexual frankness of the Confessions was not mere exhibitionism, but rather an essential component of Rousseau's philosophical method. He recognized that sexual desire was one of the most powerful forces shaping human psychology, and that conventional morality systematically distorted understanding of how sexual relationships actually affected character development. By describing his own sexual experiences with unprecedented honesty, including episodes that reflected poorly on his character, he hoped to provide accurate data about how sexual relationships could either support or undermine authentic human development. His account of his relationship with Madame de Warren, for example, showed how sexual intimacy could coexist with genuine affection and mutual respect when it was not corrupted by social conventions about marriage and property. The Confessions also revealed the psychological costs of living as an authentic individual in an inauthentic society. Rousseau's increasing paranoia and social isolation during his later years were not simply personal pathologies, but predictable consequences of trying to maintain moral integrity while participating in social relationships based on competition and deception. His conflicts with former friends like Diderot and d'Alembert illustrated how even the most well-intentioned people became corrupted when they achieved success within existing social institutions. His growing conviction that he was surrounded by enemies reflected his accurate perception that authentic individuals inevitably threatened the comfortable self-deceptions that made civilized life bearable for most people. The literary innovations of the Confessions were as revolutionary as its philosophical content. Rousseau abandoned the conventional chronological narrative structure in favor of a psychological approach that focused on the development of feeling and character rather than external events. He used techniques of detailed scene setting and emotional analysis that anticipated the development of the modern novel, while serving his philosophical purpose of demonstrating how environment shaped consciousness. Most importantly, he created a new form of prose that aimed at complete transparency, using simple language and direct statement to eliminate the barriers between author and reader that characterized conventional literary expression. The relationship between narrator and reader in the Confessions embodied Rousseau's vision of how authentic communication could restore genuine human relationships. By revealing himself completely to his readers, without the masks and artificial conventions that characterize social interaction, he hoped to create a new form of intimacy that transcended the deceptions and manipulations of civilized society. Readers who responded to his honesty with understanding and sympathy would demonstrate their own capacity for authentic feeling, while those who responded with moral condemnation would reveal their corruption by conventional social values. The Confessions thus served as both a confession in the religious sense and a test that separated readers capable of authentic response from those who remained trapped in artificial moral categories. The philosophical implications of Rousseau's autobiographical method extended far beyond his personal case. He demonstrated that individual psychology was inseparable from social and historical circumstances, anticipating later developments in sociology and anthropology that would reject abstract universal theories in favor of historically informed analysis of human development. He showed that moral philosophy needed to be based on accurate understanding of how people actually behaved, rather than on idealized theories about how they should behave. Most importantly, he proved that authentic self-knowledge required the courage to examine aspects of experience that conventional morality preferred to ignore or suppress. The Confessions also established the foundation for Rousseau's later autobiographical works, the Dialogues and the Reveries, which continued his project of using self-examination to illuminate universal truths about human nature and social relationships. These works showed how the method of radical self-honesty could be applied to increasingly complex psychological and philosophical problems, creating a new form of philosophical writing that combined the rigor of systematic analysis with the immediacy of personal testimony. Together, these autobiographical works created a new genre that influenced everything from romantic poetry to psychoanalytic theory, establishing Rousseau as the founder of modern introspective literature and depth psychology. They demonstrated that the most profound philosophical insights could emerge from the most intimate personal experiences when those experiences were examined with sufficient honesty and intelligence. Part 12. The Essay on the Origin of Languages, Communication and Human Development. Language was not simply a tool that human beings used to communicate existing thoughts, but rather the fundamental force that created human consciousness itself and determined the entire trajectory of human social development. Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages presented a revolutionary theory that challenged both rationalist philosophers who saw language as a logical system for expressing ideas and empiricist philosophers who saw it as a collection of labels for sensory experiences. Instead, he argued that language emerged from passion rather than reason, that its original function was to move rather than to inform, and that its historical development from passionate expression to rational discourse paralleled the broader human development from natural authenticity to civilized artificiality. Understanding the origin and evolution of language was therefore essential for understanding the origin and evolution of human nature itself. The conventional theories of language origin that Rousseau confronted were unable to explain how language could have emerged in the first place. Rationalist theories assumed that humans already possessed complex ideas that they then created words to express. But this begged the question of how complex ideas could exist without language to formulate them. Empiricist theories assumed that humans began by naming objects in their environment, but this failed to explain why isolated individuals would need to communicate about objects that they could perceive directly through their senses. Both approaches treated language as a secondary addition to human nature, rather than as a constitutive element that made distinctively human consciousness possible. Rousseau's alternative theory began with the recognition that the first human vocalizations were not attempts to convey information, but expressions of emotion that sought to evoke emotional responses in others. When early humans encountered strangers, they did not need to communicate facts about the external world, which both parties could observe for themselves, but rather their feelings about those encounters and their intentions toward the other person. The first words were therefore not nouns that labelled objects, but interjections that expressed fear, desire, anger, or compassion, and that sought to inspire similar or complementary emotions in others. Language began as music, as emotional expression that used sound to create psychological resonance between separate individuals. This emotional origin of language had profound implications for understanding human psychology and social development. Because language emerged from the need to share feelings rather than thoughts, it created bonds between individuals that were based on emotional identification rather than rational agreement. The first human communities were held together by shared passions rather than shared interests, by mutual sympathy rather than mutual advantage. Language thus made possible the development of moral sentiment, because it allowed individuals to communicate their responses to the suffering and joy of others, and to discover that these responses were shared by their fellow human beings. The development of language from emotional expression to rational discourse paralleled the broader human development from natural community to civilized society. As human societies became larger and more complex, language had to serve new functions beyond the communication of feeling, including the coordination of practical activities, the transmission of technical knowledge, and the regulation of social relationships. These new functions required greater precision and logical structure than emotional expression demanded, leading to the development of grammar, abstract concepts and systematic methods of reasoning. But this evolution toward rational discourse came at the cost of emotional authenticity and social unity, as language became a tool for manipulation and deception rather than a medium for genuine communication. The geographical and climatic factors that influenced language development revealed the intimate connection between environment and consciousness. Languages that developed in warm climates, where humans could gather easily and had fewer material needs, retained more of their original musical and emotional character. Languages that developed in harsh climates, where survival required complex coordination and technical innovation, became more abstract and logical, but lost their capacity to express and evoke authentic feeling. The contrast between southern languages, like Italian, which preserved the melodic and passionate qualities of original human speech, and northern languages like German, which emphasized logical precision at the expense of emotional expression, illustrated how environmental pressures shaped not only language but the entire range of human psychological capacities. The invention of writing marked a crucial turning point in the corruption of language and, by extension, human relationships. Spoken language, even in its most refined forms, retained some connection to the emotional expression from which it had emerged because it was still produced by the human body and received through the human senses. Written language, by contrast, separated communication from immediate human presence, making possible new forms of precision and complexity, but destroying the emotional resonance that had originally made language a force for human connection. Writing allowed ideas to be preserved and transmitted across time and space, but it also made possible the manipulation of language for purposes that had nothing to do with authentic communication between real human beings. The social consequences of linguistic development were as significant as the psychological consequences. Languages that remained closer to their emotional origins supported more democratic and egalitarian societies because they made genuine communication between all members of the community possible. Languages that became highly abstract and technical created social hierarchies based on linguistic competence, dividing communities into those who could master complex forms of discourse and those who remained limited to simpler forms of expression. The development of specialized vocabularies for law, philosophy, science and administration created professional classes that could exclude ordinary citizens from participation in decisions that affected their lives. Rousseau's analysis of language also revealed the fundamental tension between individual expression and social communication. Authentic feeling was always individual and unique, resistant to the generalizations and classifications that social communication required. But social life was impossible without shared linguistic conventions that allowed individuals to understand each other despite their different experiences and perspectives. The development of language thus involved a constant negotiation between the need for individual authenticity and the need for social coordination, a negotiation that inevitably resulted in some loss of authentic expression in exchange for the benefits of social cooperation. The relationship between language and thought was more complex than either rationalist or empiricist theories suggested. Language did not simply express pre-existing thoughts, but it did not simply determine thought either. Instead, language and thought developed together through a dialectical process in which new forms of expression made new forms of thinking possible, while new forms of thinking created pressures for new forms of expression. This co-evolution of language and thought meant that changes in linguistic practices could lead to changes in consciousness, and that efforts to reform human nature needed to pay careful attention to the reform of language. The practical implications of Rousseau's linguistic theory were evident in his own literary practice and his recommendations for education and social reform. He sought to develop a prose style that would recover some of the emotional directness and authenticity of original human speech while retaining the precision and complexity that modern communication required. He advocated educational practices that would teach children to express their authentic feelings before requiring them to master abstract concepts and logical reasoning. Most importantly, he envisioned social institutions that would support genuine dialogue between citizens rather than the manipulation and propaganda that characterized political discourse in existing societies. The essay on the origin of languages thus provided the foundation for understanding all of Rousseau's other works, because it explained how human consciousness itself had developed through the same process of perfectibility that had created both the achievements and the corruptions of civilization. Language was the key to understanding how humans had evolved from natural beings following instinct to social beings capable of reason, virtue, and authentic relationship. But it was also the key to understanding how this evolution could continue in directions that would recover rather than destroy the natural goodness that remained the foundation of human possibility. The reform of language was therefore central to the broader project of human regeneration that motivated all of Rousseau's philosophical and literary work. Part 13. Aesthetic Theory, Music Arts and the Corruption of Beauty. Rousseau's aesthetic theory emerged from his conviction that the arts had become divorced from their original function as expressions of authentic human feeling and had been transformed into luxury commodities that served the vanity of elites rather than the genuine needs of human communities. His analysis of music, in particular, revealed how artistic expression could either support or undermine the development of moral sentiment and social unity, depending on whether it remained connected to its emotional origins or became merely a display of technical virtuosity. The debate over French versus Italian opera that made Rousseau famous in Parisian intellectual circles was not simply a matter of aesthetic preference, but a fundamental disagreement about the relationship between art and human nature. Understanding Rousseau's aesthetic theory is essential for grasping his broader critique of civilization and his vision of how cultural expression could contribute to human regeneration rather than human corruption. The foundation of Rousseau's aesthetic philosophy was his belief that all authentic art originated in the direct expression of emotion rather than in the rational manipulation of formal elements. Just as language had begun as passionate expression before becoming abstract discourse, the arts had begun as spontaneous emotional communication before becoming elaborate technical systems designed to impress rather than to move audiences. Original music had been inseparable from poetry and dance because it served the social function of creating emotional unity within human communities through shared rhythmic and melodic experience. Original visual arts had emerged from the human need to represent and commemorate experiences that had deep emotional significance rather than from the desire to demonstrate technical skill or create beautiful objects for their own sake. The corruption of the arts paralleled the broader corruption of human relationships in civilized society. As social hierarchies developed and competition for status intensified, artistic expression became a means of displaying superiority rather than communicating authentic feeling. Wealthy patrons commissioned artworks not because they were moved by artistic vision, but because ownership of beautiful objects enhanced their social prestige. Artists learned to cater to the tastes and prejudices of their patrons rather than expressing their own genuine responses to human experience, creating works that were technically sophisticated but emotionally empty. The contrast between French and Italian opera illustrated these broader patterns of artistic corruption and potential regeneration. French opera, which Rousseau saw as the epitome of artificial artistic expression, emphasized complex harmonic structures, elaborate staging, and virtuosic vocal techniques that drew attention to the performer's skill, rather than to the emotional content of the musical drama. The French system prioritized intellectual appreciation over emotional response, creating art that could be analyzed and discussed by sophisticated audiences, but that failed to move them in any genuine way. Italian opera, by contrast, preserved more of the original connection between music and passionate expression, using simpler melodies and clearer dramatic structures that allowed audiences to experience authentic emotional responses rather than merely admiring technical accomplishments. Rousseau's own musical compositions, including his opera The Village Soothsayer and his contributions to the Encyclopedia on musical subjects, demonstrated his attempt to create art that would recover the emotional directness of original human expression while remaining accessible to contemporary audiences. He advocated for musical forms that emphasized melody over harmony, because melody was closer to the natural inflections of passionate speech, and for dramatic structures that focused on simple human emotions rather than complex allegorical or mythological themes. His goal was to create art that would enhance rather than corrupt the natural capacity for sympathy and fellow feeling that he saw as the foundation of both individual virtue and social unity. Art should make people more rather than less capable of authentic emotional response and genuine human relationship. The social function of art in a legitimate political community would be fundamentally different from its function in existing societies based on inequality and competition. Instead of serving as a luxury commodity that marked social distinctions between rich and poor, educated and ignorant, art would serve the democratic function of creating shared experiences that reinforce the bonds of citizenship. Public festivals, civic ceremonies, and communal celebrations would use music, dance, poetry, and visual display to create opportunities for citizens to experience themselves as members of a unified community rather than as isolated individuals pursuing private interests. Art would thus contribute directly to the political goal of maintaining the general will by providing emotional experiences that supported intellectual commitment to the common good. The educational implications of Rousseau's aesthetic theory were evident in his recommendations for the artistic education of children. Young people should be encouraged to express themselves through music, drawing, and other artistic activities, not in order to become professional artists, but in order to develop their capacities for authentic emotional expression and aesthetic appreciation. However, this artistic education should emphasize direct experience and personal expression rather than the study of established masterworks or the mastery of complex techniques. Children should learn to sing, draw and dance because these activities enhanced their overall human development, not because they needed to become accomplished performers or connoisseurs. Rousseau's critique of aesthetic sophistication extended to literature as well as to music and visual arts. He argued that the development of complex literary forms and elaborate rhetorical techniques had made literature less rather than more effective as a medium for communicating authentic human experience. Simple, direct prose that emerged from genuine feeling and sought to evoke genuine feeling in readers was superior to sophisticated literary works that demonstrated the author's cleverness but failed to create real emotional engagement. His own literary practice, from the passionate rhetoric of his political writings to the unprecedented honesty of his autobiographical works, exemplified this commitment to authenticity over sophistication. The relationship between aesthetic appreciation and moral development was central to Rousseau's understanding of how art could contribute to human flourishing. Genuine aesthetic experience required the same capacity for disinterested contemplation and empathetic identification that moral experience required, suggesting that artistic and moral education were fundamentally connected. People who learned to respond authentically to beauty in nature and art would be more likely to respond authentically to moral claims and social obligations. Conversely, people whose aesthetic responses had been corrupted by vanity, competition, and artificial social conventions would be incapable of the genuine moral sentiment that democratic citizenship required. The critique of artistic institutions was as important as the critique of artistic content in Rousseau's aesthetic theory. Academies, conservatories and other formal institutions for artistic training created the same kinds of artificial hierarchies and competitive relationships that corrupted political and social institutions. They taught students to value external recognition over internal satisfaction, technical accomplishment over authentic expression, and conformity to established conventions over creative innovation. Alternative forms of artistic education and cultural organization would need to be developed that could preserve and transmit artistic knowledge without destroying the spontaneity and authenticity that made art valuable in the first place. Rousseau's aesthetic theory thus provided another perspective on the fundamental tension between individual development and social organization that characterized all his thinking. Authentic artistic expression required individual freedom and spontaneity that could not be reduced to social rules or collective purposes, yet art also needed social context and shared cultural traditions to be meaningful and effective. The challenge was to create cultural institutions that could support individual artistic development while maintaining the social unity and moral purpose that made art valuable for human communities. Like his political and educational theories, his aesthetic theory pointed toward possibilities for human development that would recover natural authenticity while preserving the achievements of civilization, creating new forms of cultural expression that would be both more individual and more social than what existed in his own time. Part 14. Constitutional Theory and Practical Politics. While Rousseau is often portrayed as an abstract theorist whose ideas were too idealistic for practical application, his constitutional writings reveal a sophisticated understanding of how general principles of legitimate government could be adapted to the specific circumstances of real political communities. His constitutional proposals for Poland and Corsica demonstrated that he could translate his philosophical insights into concrete institutional arrangements that addressed practical problems while remaining faithful to fundamental democratic principles. These works also revealed the profound challenges that any attempt to implement legitimate government would face in a world where existing institutions and human psychology had been shaped by centuries of illegitimate political arrangements. Rousseau understood that constitutional reform could not succeed without broader social transformation, but he also recognized that institutional changes could contribute to the psychological and cultural changes that deeper reform required. The constitutional project for Corsica represented Rousseau's most optimistic attempt to design institutions for a society that could achieve legitimate self-government. Corsica's recent independence from Genoese rule provided an opportunity to create new political arrangements without having to overcome the entrenched interests and corrupted psychology that characterized established societies. The island's small size, relatively homogeneous population, and simple economic structure created conditions that were much closer to Rousseau's ideal than existed anywhere else in 18th century Europe. His constitutional proposals thus represented his best judgment about how the principles of the social contract could be implemented under favourable circumstances. The economic foundations of Rousseau's Corsican constitution were designed to prevent the extreme inequalities that would make legitimate government impossible. He proposed that the island's economy should remain primarily agricultural, with most citizens owning small farms that they worked themselves rather than large estates worked by dependent labourers. Manufacturing and commerce should be limited to meeting basic needs rather than creating luxury goods for export, because extensive commercial relationships would inevitably lead to the competitive psychology and social inequalities that corrupted Republican government. Population growth should be encouraged through policies that supported marriage and child-rearing. But immigration should be restricted to prevent the cultural diversity that would make consensus on fundamental values difficult to achieve. The political institutions outlined in the Corsican constitution reflected Rousseau's conviction that democratic participation needed to be direct rather than representative. All citizens would participate regularly in local assemblies that would handle most governmental business, with higher-level assemblies composed of delegates who were strictly bound by the instructions of their constituents. These delegates would not be representatives in the modern sense, with discretion to vote according to their own judgment, but rather agents who carried out specific mandates from the assemblies that had chosen them. This system would ensure that sovereignty remained with the people, rather than being transferred to elected officials who might develop interests separate from those of their constituents. The educational and cultural policies proposed for Corsica were designed to create the civic virtue that legitimate government required. Public education would emphasize practical skills and moral development rather than abstract learning that was irrelevant to the lives of ordinary citizens. Public festivals and ceremonies would create opportunities for citizens to experience themselves as members of a unified community while celebrating the distinctive history and culture that made Corsican identity unique. Religious policies would support traditional Catholic faith while preventing clerical interference in political affairs and ensuring that religious diversity did not undermine social unity. The constitutional proposals for Poland presented much more difficult challenges because Poland was a large, complex society with entrenched aristocratic institutions and deep cultural divisions. Rousseau could not propose the kind of radical transformation that he had outlined for Corsica, but had to work within existing constraints while gradually moving Polish institutions in more democratic directions. His approach demonstrated how his general principles could be adapted to less favourable circumstances without being completely abandoned. The Polish constitution represented a strategy for gradual reform that could eventually lead to legitimate government, even in societies where immediate implementation of democratic principles was impossible. The most innovative aspect of Rousseau's Polish constitutional proposals was his strategy for maintaining national independence while implementing internal reforms. He recognized that Poland's geographic position between powerful neighbors made military strength essential for survival, but that traditional military institutions were incompatible with democratic government. His solution involved creating a citizen militia based on universal military service rather than a professional army that could be used by rulers against their own people. This militia would not only provide effective defense against external enemies, but would also serve an educational function, teaching citizens the discipline and cooperation that democratic self-government required. The economic reforms proposed for Poland were necessarily more modest than those outlined for Corsica, but they reflected the same underlying principles about the relationship between economic and political equality. Rousseau could not propose the abolition of serfdom immediately because such a radical change would destabilize the entire social order, but he outlined a gradual process of emancipation that would eventually create a society of independent farmers and craftsmen. Land reforms would limit the size of individual estates, while providing opportunities for landless peasants to acquire small holdings of their own. Commercial policies would encourage domestic production while limiting the luxury imports that corrupted aristocratic culture and drained wealth from the country. The treatment of national identity in both constitutional projects revealed Rousseau's understanding of how patriotic sentiment could support, rather than undermine, legitimate government. Citizens needed strong emotional attachments to their political communities that would motivate the sacrifices that self-government sometimes required, but these attachments should be based on shared commitment to justice and freedom, rather than on hostility toward other nations. Corsican and Polish patriotism should celebrate the distinctive virtues and achievements of these societies, while recognizing that all peoples had the same fundamental rights and deserved the same respect. National independence was valuable not as an end in itself, but as a condition for implementing just institutions that could serve as examples for other societies seeking their own liberation. The institutional mechanisms proposed in both constitutions for preventing the corruption of government reflected Rousseau's deep understanding of the psychological tendencies that led officials to abuse their authority. Rotation in office would prevent any individual from developing a permanent interest in maintaining governmental power, while strict accountability procedures would ensure that officials remained subordinate to popular will. The separation of different governmental functions among different institutions would prevent the concentration of power, while maintaining the unity of purpose that effective government required. Most importantly, regular assemblies of all citizens would provide opportunities for popular review of governmental performance and correction of policies that departed from the general will. The practical difficulties that Rousseau anticipated in implementing these constitutional arrangements revealed his realistic assessment of the obstacles that democratic reform would face. Existing elites would resist changes that threatened their privileges, while ordinary citizens who had been educated for dependence rather than self-government would need time to develop the skills and attitudes that democratic participation required. External enemies would seek to exploit internal divisions and conflicts created by the reform process, while internal factions would attempt to use constitutional changes to advance their particular interests rather than the common good. Success would require not only well-designed institutions but also favourable circumstances, wise leadership and a degree of good fortune that could not be guaranteed in advance. The constitutional writings thus demonstrated both the practical applicability and the inherent limitations of Rousseau's political theory. His general principles could indeed be translated into specific institutional arrangements that addressed real political problems. But such translation required careful attention to particular circumstances and acceptance of compromises that fell short of theoretical ideals. Constitutional reform could contribute to the broader transformation of human nature that legitimate government required, but it could not accomplish this transformation by itself. Political institutions were both a means toward and a product of the moral and cultural changes that would make authentic democracy possible, requiring a coordinated approach to reform that addressed all aspects of social life simultaneously. Part 15. Moral Sentiment Theory, the Foundation of Ethics. Rousseau's moral philosophy rested on the revolutionary claim that ethical judgment originated in natural feeling rather than rational calculation, challenging both religious traditions that based morality on divine command and philosophical traditions that based it on abstract reasoning about universal principles. His analysis of moral sentiment anticipated later developments in psychology and anthropology by recognizing that human beings possessed innate emotional capacities that provided reliable guidance for ethical conduct when those capacities were not corrupted by artificial social arrangements. The famous concept of natural pity or compassion that Rousseau placed at the center of his moral theory was not merely a philosophical hypothesis, but an empirically observable aspect of human psychology that could be developed through proper education and social institutions, or destroyed through improper ones. Understanding moral sentiment theory is essential for grasping how Rousseau thought individual virtue and social justice could be reconciled in a legitimate political order. The foundation of Rousseau's moral sentiment theory was his observation that human beings possessed a natural reluctance to witness the suffering of other sentient creatures. This reluctance operated below the level of conscious reasoning as an immediate emotional response that required no justification beyond the psychological discomfort it created. A person who saw another person in pain would instinctively feel distress themselves, not because they had reasoned that suffering was bad, or because they had been taught that they should care about others, but because witnessing suffering naturally evoked sympathetic pain in any psychologically healthy observer. This capacity for sympathetic identification provided the emotional foundation that made moral reasoning possible, because it created internal motivation for considering the welfare of others in addition to one's own welfare. Natural compassion differed fundamentally from both rational moral principles and learned social conventions. Unlike rational principles, compassion did not require complex reasoning about consequences, universal laws, or abstract ideals, but emerged spontaneously from direct emotional engagement with particular situations. Unlike social conventions, compassion was not arbitrary or culturally relative, but reflected universal aspects of human psychology that operated across different societies and historical periods. However, compassion was also more flexible and contextually sensitive than either rational principles or social conventions, because it responded to the specific features of particular situations rather than applying predetermined rules or categories. The development of moral sentiment through individual psychological growth paralleled the broader human development from nature through civilization toward potential regeneration. In very young children, compassionate responses were immediate and uncomplicated, emerging automatically whenever they witnessed distress in others without being filtered through social judgments about whether the suffering was deserved or undeserved. As children were educated into civilized society, however, they learned to suppress natural compassion in favor of artificial moral categories that reflected the interests and prejudices of their social class rather than universal human values. The recovery of moral sentiment in adulthood required unlearning these artificial categories and rediscovering the capacity for direct emotional response that had been natural in childhood but had been systematically corrupted by social education. The social conditions that supported or undermined the development of moral sentiment were central to Rousseau's analysis of how individual virtue and social justice were interconnected. Extreme inequality made genuine moral sentiment impossible because it created permanent relationships of domination and subordination that prevented people from recognizing their fundamental similarity to others. When some people had vastly more wealth and power than others, they inevitably came to see themselves as fundamentally different kinds of beings who were not subject to the same moral considerations that applied to ordinary people. Similarly, people who were systematically oppressed and degraded could not maintain the psychological health that moral sentiment required because constant humiliation and deprivation destroyed their capacity for the generous emotional responses that ethical conduct demanded. The relationship between moral sentiment and rational moral reasoning was more complex than either rationalist or sentimentalist theories suggested. Feeling without reasoning was blind, capable of responding to immediate situations, but incapable of developing consistent principles that could guide conduct across different circumstances. But reasoning without feeling was empty, capable of constructing elaborate theoretical systems, but incapable of providing the internal motivation that would make people actually care about following moral principles when doing so conflicted with immediate self-interest. Authentic moral judgment required the integration of feeling and reasoning in ways that preserved the emotional directness of natural compassion while developing the consistency and universality that rational reflection could provide. The educational implications of moral sentiment theory were evident in Rousseau's recommendations for how children should be taught to develop ethical judgment. Rather than beginning with abstract moral rules or religious commandments, moral education should focus on cultivating the natural capacity for sympathetic identification with others through direct experience of helping and being helped. Children should learn to recognize suffering and take pleasure in relieving it, to understand how their actions affected others, and to develop emotional habits that would support ethical conduct throughout their lives. Only after these emotional foundations were secure should children be introduced to more abstract forms of moral reasoning that could help them apply their natural moral sentiments to complex social and political questions. The political implications of moral sentiment theory were equally important for understanding how legitimate government could be established and maintained. Citizens capable of participating in the general will needed to be able to identify emotionally with the welfare of their fellow citizens, rather than simply calculating what policies would serve their narrow self-interest. This emotional identification could not be created through rational argument alone, but required social institutions that fostered genuine fellow-feeling among citizens through shared experiences and common purposes. Political arrangements that systematically pitted citizens against each other in zero-sum competitions would destroy the moral sentiment that democratic government required, regardless of how well-designed the formal constitutional arrangements might be. The relationship between individual moral development and social moral progress revealed another dimension of the tension between personal authenticity and social responsibility that characterized all of Rousseau's thinking. Individuals needed to maintain the capacity for direct moral response that could sometimes require them to act against social conventions and legal requirements when those conventions and requirements conflicted with genuine ethical demands. But societies also needed shared moral standards that could coordinate the behavior of many individuals and provide stable expectations for social interaction. The challenge was to create social institutions that could preserve individual moral autonomy while maintaining sufficient consensus on fundamental values to make collective action possible. The critique of conventional morality that emerged from Rousseau's moral sentiment theory extended to both religious and secular ethical systems. Religious morality often required people to suppress natural compassion in favor of abstract theological principles that had little connection to actual human welfare, while secular morality often reduced ethical judgment to calculations of utility that ignored the emotional dimensions of moral experience. Both approaches failed to recognize that authentic moral judgment required the integration of feeling and reasoning in ways that respected both the universality of human emotional capacities and the particularity of individual situations and relationships. A reformed approach to ethics would need to recover the wisdom embedded in natural moral sentiment while developing intellectual frameworks that could extend that wisdom to complex social and political problems. The practical application of moral sentiment theory required careful attention to the social and psychological conditions that could either support or undermine the development of ethical judgment. Families, schools, Religious institutions and political arrangements all needed to be organized in ways that encouraged, rather than discouraged, the natural human capacity for sympathetic identification with others. This meant creating social environments where people could experience themselves as fundamentally similar to others, despite differences in wealth, status, culture, or personal characteristics. It also meant protecting individuals from the kinds of systematic degradation and humiliation that would destroy their capacity for the generous emotional responses that moral sentiment required, while challenging social arrangements that encouraged callousness, cruelty, or indifference to human suffering. Part 16. The Individual versus Society. The Eternal Tension. The fundamental tension between individual authenticity and social obligation that runs through all of Rousseau's work reflected his recognition that human beings were simultaneously individual and social creatures, whose needs for personal fulfillment and community belonging could never be perfectly reconciled. This tension was not a problem that could be solved through better institutional arrangements or improved education, but rather a permanent feature of the human condition that required constant negotiation and careful balance. Rousseau's greatness as a philosopher lay not in providing simple solutions to this dilemma, but in analyzing its multiple dimensions with unprecedented depth and honesty, revealing how the apparent oppositions between nature and society, freedom and order, authenticity and civilization were actually interconnected aspects of a single complex process of human development. Understanding this central tension is essential for grasping both the unity of Rousseau's seemingly contradictory ideas and their continuing relevance to contemporary social and political problems. The tension emerged most clearly in Rousseau's analysis of how individual psychological development required social relationships that inevitably corrupted the very authenticity that made individuals valuable. Human beings could only develop their distinctive capacities for reason, imagination, and moral judgment through interaction with other human beings. But such interaction also exposed them to competition, deception, and conformity pressures that distorted their natural goodness. The language that made complex thought possible also made manipulation and self-deception possible, while the social recognition that motivated individual achievement also created vanity and artificial needs that destroyed natural contentment. Every advance in human capabilities thus came at the cost of some loss of natural authenticity, creating a tragic dimension to human development that could be managed but never completely overcome. The political manifestation of this tension appeared in the paradox that legitimate government required citizens who were simultaneously free individuals and obedient members of a collective body. Democratic participation demanded citizens who could think independently and make autonomous moral judgments. But social unity required citizens who were willing to subordinate their individual preferences to collective decisions when those decisions reflected the general will. The freedom that democracy promised could only be achieved through submission to authority that citizens had participated in creating. But this submission was only legitimate when it emerged from genuine individual choice rather than external coercion. The social contract thus required a form of voluntary self-limitation that preserved individual autonomy while making collective action possible. But this voluntary self-limitation could easily degenerate into either anarchic individualism or totalitarian conformity if the delicate balance was not carefully maintained. The educational dimension of the tension revealed the impossibility of completely protecting individual development from social corruption while still preparing individuals for social life. Emile's education was designed to preserve natural goodness as long as possible while gradually introducing him to the realities of social existence, but this protective approach could only work under artificial conditions that were not available to most children. Real education had to take place in social contexts where children were exposed to the competitive and conformity pressures that Rousseau wanted to avoid, making it impossible to prevent some corruption of natural authenticity in exchange for the social skills that civilized life required. The goal of education could not be the preservation of pristine natural innocence, but rather the development of individuals who could navigate social relationships while maintaining as much authentic feeling and independent judgment as possible under the circumstances. The economic aspect of the individual-society tension appeared in the contradiction between the individual desire for security and independence and the social need for cooperation and interdependence. Self-sufficient individuals who owned enough property to meet their needs without depending on others would be free from the exploitation and manipulation that characterized market relationships. But such individual self-sufficiency would make the cooperation necessary for economic progress and social solidarity impossible. Economic interdependence created opportunities for mutual benefit through specialization and exchange, but it also created vulnerabilities to exploitation and manipulation that could destroy both individual autonomy and social trust. The challenge was to organize economic relationships in ways that preserved individual independence while enabling collective prosperity. But this required forms of social coordination that were extremely difficult to achieve and maintain. The cultural dimension of the tension involved the relationship between individual creativity and social tradition. Authentic individual expression required freedom from conventional constraints and social expectations, but such expression was only meaningful within cultural contexts that provided shared symbols, languages and values that made communication possible. Artists and writers needed to rebel against established traditions in order to create something genuinely new. But they also needed those traditions as the foundation from which their rebellion could emerge and the audience to which their innovations could be addressed. Cultural creativity thus required both individual freedom and social solidarity, both innovation and conservation, in combinations that were inherently unstable and constantly evolving. The psychological dimension of the tension appeared in the conflict between the need for social recognition and the need for authentic self-knowledge. Human beings could only develop secure identities through relationships with others who recognized and valued their distinctive qualities, but the desire for social recognition inevitably led to the modification of behavior and self-presentation in ways that distorted authentic self-expression. The amour propre that motivated individuals to seek approval and status from others was both necessary for psychological health and destructive of the amour de soi that constituted authentic self-regard. Individuals needed to care about what others thought of them in order to develop social skills and moral sensitivity, but they also needed to maintain sufficient independence from social opinion to preserve their capacity for genuine self-reflection and autonomous judgment. Rousseau's approach to managing this fundamental tension involved accepting its permanence while developing strategies for minimizing its most destructive effects. Rather than seeking perfect solutions that would eliminate the conflict between individual and social needs, he focused on creating conditions that would allow both individual authenticity and social cooperation to flourish as much as possible within the constraints of human nature and historical circumstances. This approach required constant vigilance against the tendency for either individual or social needs to dominate completely, and flexibility in adjusting institutional arrangements as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. The goal was not static harmony, but dynamic balance that could adapt to changing conditions while preserving essential human values. The practical implications of this approach appeared in Rousseau's recommendations for institutional design that would build in protections for both individual rights and collective welfare. Political institutions should include mechanisms for individual dissent and minority protection while maintaining the capacity for collective decision-making and action. Economic institutions should provide opportunities for individual initiative and achievement while preventing extreme inequalities that would undermine social solidarity. Educational institutions should encourage individual creativity and critical thinking while transmitting shared cultural knowledge and values. Religious and cultural institutions should support individual spiritual development while maintaining social unity around fundamental moral principles. The key was creating institutional frameworks that could accommodate both individual diversity and social coherence without sacrificing either completely to the other. The contemporary relevance of Rousseau's analysis of the individual-society tension is evident in current debates about issues ranging from economic inequality and political polarization to cultural diversity and technological change. Modern societies continue to struggle with the same fundamental challenges that Rousseau identified: how to preserve individual freedom while maintaining social solidarity, how to encourage innovation while preserving valuable traditions, how to respect diversity while maintaining shared values, and how to promote individual achievement while ensuring collective welfare. His insights about the psychological and social dynamics that create these tensions remain as relevant today as they were in the 18th century, because they address permanent features of the human condition rather than temporary historical circumstances. Understanding Rousseau's analysis of these tensions can help contemporary societies develop more nuanced and effective approaches to the perennial challenge of balancing individual and social needs in ways that promote both personal fulfillment and collective flourishing. Part 17. Revolutionary Legacy, From Theory to Historical Practice. The transformation of Rousseau's philosophical ideas into revolutionary political practice revealed both the power of his insights about human nature and popular sovereignty and the dangerous simplifications that occurred when complex theoretical concepts were translated into slogans for mass political movements. The revolutionaries who invoked Rousseau's name in America and France understood some aspects of his thinking with remarkable clarity, while completely misunderstanding others, creating political movements that embodied both his highest aspirations for human liberation and his worst fears about how democratic ideals could be corrupted by factional conflict and demagogic manipulation. Examining this revolutionary legacy provides crucial insights into both the practical applicability and the inherent limitations of Rousseau's political philosophy, revealing how ideas that seemed utopian in their original context could become all too real when implemented under the pressures of actual historical circumstances. The distance between theoretical possibility and practical achievement that characterize these revolutionary experiences continues to challenge anyone who seeks to apply Rousseau's insights to contemporary political problems. The American Revolution drew selectively from Rousseau's ideas about popular sovereignty and legitimate government, while ignoring his warnings about the corrupting effects of representation and commercial society. The Declaration of Independence echoed Rousseau's argument that legitimate government could only be based on the consent of the governed, and that people had the right to alter or abolish governments that failed to serve their purposes. The revolutionary rhetoric about natural rights and popular resistance to tyranny reflected Rousseau's conviction that existing political arrangements were illegitimate and that people retained the authority to create new institutions based on their own understanding of justice and the common good. But the constitutional system that emerged from the American Revolution embodied precisely the kind of representative government that Rousseau had rejected as a form of elected aristocracy that would inevitably lead to the domination of the many by the few. The Federalist authors understood this tension and attempted to resolve it through institutional mechanisms that would make representation compatible with popular sovereignty. The system of checks and balances was designed to prevent any single faction from dominating the government, while the federal structure was intended to create multiple levels of representation that would allow different interests to be expressed without destroying national unity. Elections were supposed to ensure that representatives remained accountable to their constituents, while the separation of powers was intended to prevent the concentration of authority that Rousseau had identified as the primary threat to legitimate government. But these institutional solutions created new problems that Rousseau had anticipated, including the development of political parties that encouraged citizens to think in terms of factional advantage rather than the common good, and the emergence of professional politicians whose interests diverged from those of ordinary citizens. The French Revolution provided a more dramatic test of Rousseau's ideas, because it attempted to implement more radical changes in a society that was much less prepared for democratic government than the American colonies had been. The early revolutionary rhetoric about the general will and popular sovereignty drew directly from Rousseau's political theory, with revolutionary leaders claiming to represent the authentic voice of the people against the corrupt aristocratic and monarchical institutions of the old regime. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen reflected Rousseau's arguments about natural equality and the illegitimacy of hereditary privilege, while the revolutionary festivals and civic ceremonies borrowed from his ideas about civil religion and the importance of emotional identification with the political community. But the actual course of the revolution revealed how difficult it was to create the social and psychological conditions that legitimate democratic government required. The Terror represented the most troubling manifestation of how Rousseau's ideas could be distorted when applied by people who misunderstood their philosophical foundations. Robespierre and other revolutionary leaders claimed to be implementing the general will when they eliminated political opposition and imposed ideological conformity through violence. But their actions violated fundamental principles of Rousseau's political theory. The general will could only emerge through genuine deliberation among free and equal citizens, not through the suppression of dissent by self-appointed guardians of revolutionary purity. The use of terror to enforce political virtue contradicted Rousseau's conviction that authentic virtue could only develop through education and free choice rather than external coercion. And the elevation of revolutionary ideology above the actual welfare of citizens reversed the proper relationship between means and ends in legitimate government. The failure of the French Revolution to establish stable democratic institutions illustrated the practical difficulties that Rousseau had identified in implementing legitimate government in large, complex societies with deep social divisions. The Revolution's attempt to create instant equality and virtue through legislative decree ignored his warnings about the need for gradual transformation of social institutions and human psychology over extended periods of time. The revolutionary leaders' confidence that rational planning could quickly solve problems that had developed over centuries reflected an Enlightenment optimism about human reason that Rousseau had explicitly rejected in favour of more complex understandings of how social change actually occurred. The eventual emergence of Napoleon as emperor demonstrated how democratic movements could be captured by ambitious individuals who used popular rhetoric to justify personal dictatorship, fulfilling Rousseau's prediction that illegitimate government would eventually reassert itself unless deeper changes in social relationships and human psychology had prepared the ground for lasting democratic reform. The 19th century socialist movements that claimed Rousseau as a forerunner understood his critique of property and inequality, but missed his warnings about the dangers of concentrating power in the hands of revolutionary elites. Marx and other socialist theorists appreciated Rousseau's analysis of how private property created class conflict and social oppression, but they rejected his emphasis on individual moral development in favor of structural changes in economic relationships. The socialist conviction that changing economic arrangements would automatically solve political and social problems reflected a materialist reductionism that Rousseau would have recognized as another form of the same mechanistic thinking that characterized liberal capitalism. Both socialist and capitalist ideologies assumed that human beings were primarily economic creatures, whose behavior was determined by their material circumstances. While Rousseau understood that economic, political, social and psychological factors were interconnected in complex ways that could not be reduced to any single causal mechanism. The 20th century totalitarian movements that claimed to represent the authentic will of the people while suppressing all opposition demonstrated how democratic rhetoric could be used to justify anti-democratic practices. Fascist and communist leaders used concepts derived from Rousseau's political theory to argue that they embodied the general will of their peoples and that opposition to their rule was therefore illegitimate by definition. But these movements violated every substantive principle of Rousseau's democratic theory by eliminating the conditions for genuine popular deliberation, concentrating power in the hands of unaccountable leaders, and using violence to enforce ideological conformity. The totalitarian appropriation of democratic language revealed how political concepts could be corrupted when they were separated from the philosophical and moral foundations that had originally given them meaning, creating the appearance of popular government while destroying its substance. The contemporary global spread of democratic institutions has created new opportunities to test Rousseau's insights about the conditions that legitimate government requires. Many societies that have adopted democratic constitutions and electoral systems continue to struggle with the same problems that Rousseau identified as obstacles to authentic self-government, including extreme inequality, social fragmentation, cultural conflict, and the manipulation of popular opinion by powerful elites. The emergence of populist movements that claim to represent the authentic voice of the people against corrupt establishments reflects continuing tensions between democratic ideals and democratic practices that Rousseau's analysis helps to illuminate. Whether contemporary democratic societies can develop the social solidarity, civic virtue, and institutional wisdom that sustainable self-government requires remains an open question that will require careful attention to the lessons that can be learned from both the successes and failures of previous attempts to implement Rousseau's democratic vision. The revolutionary legacy of Rousseau's ideas thus provides a complex and sobering perspective on the possibilities and limitations of democratic reform. His insights about popular sovereignty, natural equality, and the corruption of existing institutions have inspired liberation movements around the world and continue to provide powerful critiques of illegitimate authority. But the historical experience of democratic revolutions has also confirmed his warnings about the difficulties of creating the social and psychological conditions that legitimate self-government requires, and the dangers of attempting rapid political transformation without adequate preparation of institutions and human character. Understanding this revolutionary legacy is essential for anyone who seeks to apply Rousseau's insights to contemporary political challenges. because it reveals both the transformative potential and the tragic limitations of democratic idealism when it encounters the realities of human nature and historical circumstance. Part 18. The Critique of Enlightenment Rationalism. Rousseau's relationship with the Enlightenment was profoundly paradoxical. He was simultaneously its most influential critic and its most authentic representative, challenging its fundamental assumptions about reason, progress, and human nature, while embodying its deepest commitment to human liberation and social transformation. His critique of Enlightenment rationalism was not a rejection of reason itself, but rather an attempt to understand the proper role of rational analysis within a more complete understanding of human psychology and social development. He argued that his fellow philosophes had made reason into an idol that blinded them to the emotional and social foundations that made rational thought possible, leading them to propose reforms that would actually increase rather than decrease human misery by ignoring the complex relationships between individual psychology and social institutions. Understanding Rousseau's critique of Enlightenment rationalism is essential for grasping both his contribution to 18th century intellectual life and his anticipation of later romantic and existentialist challenges to purely rational approaches to human problems. The foundation of Rousseau's critique was his argument that reason was not the primary or original human capacity, but rather a late development that depended on more fundamental emotional and social capabilities. The Enlightenment philosophers had assumed that reason was what distinguished humans from animals, and that the development of rational faculties represented the highest achievement of human evolution. Rousseau argued that this assumption inverted the actual order of human development because rational thought was only possible after humans had developed language, social relationships, and moral sentiments that were themselves based on non-rational emotional capacities. Reason was therefore a tool that could be used well or badly, depending on the character of the social and emotional context in which it operated, rather than an independent faculty that could provide reliable guidance for human conduct when separated from its psychological and social foundations. The political implications of this critique were evident in Rousseau's analysis of how rational reforms could actually worsen social problems when they ignored the emotional and psychological dimensions of human behavior. Enlightenment reformers assumed that people would automatically adopt more rational practices once they understood that such practices were in their own interest. But this assumption ignored the complex motivations that actually drove human behavior. People often acted against their rational self-interest because of emotional attachments, social pressures, or psychological needs that rational analysis could not address, making purely rational reforms ineffective or counterproductive. Successful social reform required understanding and working with these non-rational aspects of human psychology rather than trying to overcome them through rational argument alone. The economic dimension of Rousseau's critique challenged the Enlightenment assumption that commercial development and technological progress would automatically improve human welfare. Most philosophers believed that the expansion of trade, the development of manufacturing, and the application of scientific knowledge to practical problems would create prosperity and happiness that would benefit all members of society. Rousseau argued that this optimistic assessment ignored the social and psychological costs of economic development, including the creation of artificial needs that could never be satisfied, the destruction of traditional communities that had provided meaning and security, and the concentration of wealth and power that made some people dependent on others. Economic progress might increase material prosperity, but it also created new forms of inequality and alienation that made authentic human relationships and genuine happiness more rather than less difficult to achieve. The educational implications of Rousseau's critique were perhaps the most radical, because they challenged the Enlightenment faith in the power of knowledge and instruction to improve human character. The philosophers believed that ignorance was the primary source of human misery, and that education based on scientific knowledge and rational analysis would create more virtuous and happier individuals. Rousseau argued that conventional education actually corrupted natural human goodness by forcing children to learn things they did not need to know in ways that destroyed their natural curiosity and authentic feeling. Real education needed to work with natural human development rather than against it, focusing on the cultivation of moral sentiment and practical judgment rather than the accumulation of abstract knowledge that had no connection to lived experience. The religious dimension of Rousseau's critique revealed his conviction that Enlightenment attacks on traditional religion ignored the legitimate human needs that religious experience addressed. Many philosophers believed that religious belief was simply superstition that would disappear as scientific knowledge advanced and rational thinking became more widespread. Rousseau argued that religion answered fundamental human needs for meaning, community, and moral guidance that purely rational philosophies could not satisfy, and that attempts to eliminate religious sentiment would create spiritual emptiness that would make authentic virtue and social solidarity impossible. The challenge was not to destroy religion, but to reform it in ways that preserved its emotional and social functions while eliminating the dogmatism and intolerance that had made it a source of conflict and oppression. The methodological aspects of Rousseau's critique challenged the Enlightenment assumption that the methods of natural science could be directly applied to human and social problems. The philosophers believed that the same empirical observation and rational analysis that had produced advances in physics and chemistry could be used to discover universal laws of human behavior that would provide the foundation for social and political reform. Rousseau argued that human beings were fundamentally different from natural objects because they possessed consciousness, emotion, and the capacity for moral choice that made their behavior irreducibly complex and unpredictable. Understanding human problems required methods that could accommodate this complexity, including historical analysis, psychological insight, and moral reflection that went beyond purely empirical observation and logical deduction. The aesthetic dimension of Rousseau's critique anticipated later romantic challenges to Enlightenment rationalism by arguing that authentic beauty and artistic expression could not be reduced to rational principles or technical rules. Many Enlightenment theorists believed that artistic excellence could be achieved through the application of scientific principles of composition, proportion, and effect that could be taught and learned like any other technical skill. Rousseau argued that genuine artistic expression required emotional authenticity and spontaneous creativity that could not be captured by rational analysis or replicated through technical training. The attempt to rationalize art would destroy precisely those qualities that made it valuable for human development, reducing aesthetic experience to intellectual exercise that had no connection to genuine feeling or moral insight. The psychological dimensions of Rousseau's critique revealed his understanding that human consciousness was fundamentally shaped by non-rational factors, including emotion, imagination, and social relationships that rational analysis could describe but not control. The Enlightenment assumption that people could achieve happiness and virtue through rational self-direction ignored the extent to which individual psychology was shaped by social environment, historical circumstances, and unconscious processes that operated below the level of conscious reflection. Successful approaches to human development needed to work with these non-rational factors rather than trying to overcome them through rational planning, creating social and educational environments that would support the natural development of virtue and happiness rather than trying to impose them through external direction. This required a more humble and realistic assessment of what rational reform could and could not accomplish, combined with greater attention to the emotional and social conditions that made rational thinking possible in the first place. The contemporary relevance of Rousseau's critique of Enlightenment rationalism is evident in ongoing debates about the role of expertise, technology, and rational planning in addressing social problems. Many contemporary policy approaches continue to reflect Enlightenment assumptions about the power of rational analysis and scientific knowledge to solve human problems, while ignoring the emotional, cultural, and psychological factors that actually determine how people respond to rational arguments and policy interventions. Rousseau's insights about the limitations of purely rational approaches to human problems remain relevant for understanding why technical solutions often fail to achieve their intended goals, and why successful social reform requires attention to the full complexity of human motivation and social relationships. His critique provides valuable perspective for developing more effective and humane approaches to contemporary challenges that acknowledge both the power and the limitations of rational analysis while working to create social conditions that support rather than undermine human flourishing. Part 19. Solitude, Nature, and the Recovery of Authentic Self. The final phase of Rousseau's intellectual development was marked by his increasing withdrawal from social life and his turn towards solitary contemplation of nature as a means of recovering the authentic selfhood that he believed had been corrupted by his involvement in the competitive world of Parisian intellectual society. The Reveries of the Solitary Walker, his last major work, represented both a philosophical meditation on the relationship between solitude and authenticity, and a practical exploration of how individuals could maintain their integrity in a world that systematically rewarded conformity and deception. His famous botanizing expeditions and his detailed observations of plant life provided him with a model for the kind of direct, unmediated relationship with reality that he believed was necessary for genuine self-knowledge and moral clarity. Understanding this final dimension of Rousseau's thought is essential for grasping the full scope of his critique of civilization and his vision of how authentic human existence might be recovered even under the most adverse social circumstances. Rousseau's turn toward solitude was not a retreat from philosophical engagement, but rather a deepening of his analysis of the relationship between social life and individual authenticity. His experiences with former friends who had become enemies convinced him that sustained social relationships inevitably led to the corruption of natural sentiment through competition, jealousy, and the desire for social recognition that he called amour-propre. Even relationships that began with genuine affection and mutual respect gradually degenerated into manipulation and deception as the participants became involved in social networks that rewarded artificial rather than authentic behavior. Solitude provided the only reliable escape from these corrupting social dynamics, creating space for the recovery of natural feeling and genuine self-reflection that social life made impossible. The practice of botanizing that occupied much of Rousseau's attention during his final years served multiple functions in his quest for authentic self-recovery. The detailed observation of plant life required the kind of patient, disinterested attention that freed consciousness from the anxieties and artificial needs that social competition created. Plants could be studied for their own sake, rather than for any advantage that such study might provide in social relationships, making botanical observation a form of pure contemplation that contrasted sharply with the instrumental thinking that characterized most social interaction. The complexity and beauty of natural forms provided evidence of an underlying order and intelligence in the universe that supported religious feeling without requiring acceptance of the dogmatic theological systems that had been used to justify social oppression. The epistemological implications of Rousseau's botanical studies revealed his conviction that authentic knowledge could only emerge from direct personal experience rather than from the accumulated wisdom of cultural traditions or the abstract reasoning of philosophical systems. Each plant that he observed and classified represented a unique encounter with reality that could not be reduced to general principles or theoretical frameworks developed by others. This direct engagement with natural phenomena provided a model for the kind of immediate, unmediated relationship with truth that he believed was necessary for both intellectual and moral development. Knowledge gained through personal observation and reflection was more reliable than knowledge inherited from authorities because it was based on the actual capacities and limitations of individual human consciousness, rather than on the artificial categories and conventional assumptions that characterized social learning. The psychological function of solitary nature contemplation in Rousseau's personal development reflected his understanding of how individual consciousness could be restored to health after being damaged by social corruption. The peace and regularity of natural processes provided a healing environment for psychological wounds created by social conflict and betrayal, while the beauty and complexity of natural forms nourished the aesthetic and spiritual capacities that social competition had suppressed. Time spent in solitary contemplation allowed natural emotional rhythms to reassert themselves after being distorted by the artificial pressures and expectations of social life. Most importantly, solitude created opportunities for genuine self-examination that could distinguish between authentic personal responses and learned social behaviors, making possible the recovery of the natural goodness that Rousseau believed remained buried beneath layers of social conditioning. The moral dimensions of Rousseau's solitary practices revealed his conviction that authentic virtue could only develop through individual reflection and choice rather than through social pressure or external instruction. Moral rules and principles that were accepted simply because they were socially approved or intellectually convincing lacked the personal foundation that would make them effective guides for conduct when they conflicted with immediate self-interest or social pressure. Genuine moral commitment required internal conviction that could only emerge from direct personal experience of the difference between authentic and inauthentic ways of living. Solitary reflection provided the necessary conditions for this kind of moral self-discovery by removing the external influences that prevented individuals from attending to their own deepest responses to moral questions. The relationship between solitude and social responsibility in Rousseau's final thinking was more complex than simple withdrawal or escapism. His solitary practices were intended not to avoid social obligation, but to prepare him for more authentic and effective social engagement by purifying his motivations and clarifying his understanding of genuine human needs. Individuals who had recovered their natural goodness through solitary reflection would be better equipped to contribute to social reform because they would not be motivated by the desire for personal recognition or advantage that corrupted most social action. They could serve the common good because they had transcended the particular interests and artificial needs that made most people incapable of genuine concern for others. But this transcendence required periodic withdrawal from social life to maintain clarity about authentic versus artificial motivations. The literary innovations of the Reveries reflected Rousseau's attempt to develop new forms of expression that could communicate the insights gained through solitary contemplation without being corrupted by the conventional rhetorical strategies that characterized social discourse. The fragmented meditative structure of the work mirrored the actual processes of consciousness during solitary reflection, avoiding the logical organization and argumentative development that would have imposed artificial order on genuinely spontaneous thought. The focus on particular moments of insight and feeling rather than general principles or systematic theories preserved the immediacy and authenticity of direct personal experience while making it accessible to readers who were seeking their own paths toward authentic self-discovery. This literary approach anticipated later developments in stream-of-consciousness writing and phenomenological philosophy that would attempt to capture the actual texture of conscious experience rather than translating it into conventional conceptual frameworks. The religious dimensions of Rousseau's solitary contemplation revealed his continuing search for forms of spiritual experience that could provide meaning and moral guidance without requiring submission to external religious authorities. The sense of harmony and purpose that he experienced during his nature walks provided evidence of divine presence that was more convincing than any theological argument or scriptural authority. This natural religion was simultaneously more personal and more universal than conventional religious systems because it was based on direct spiritual experience that was available to anyone willing to undertake serious contemplation of natural beauty and order. But it was also more demanding than conventional religion because it required individual spiritual development rather than simply accepting inherited beliefs and participating in established rituals. The political implications of Rousseau's emphasis on solitary self-development were evident in his conviction that sustainable social reform required the prior transformation of individual consciousness rather than simply the restructuring of political and economic institutions. Individuals who had not recovered their capacity for authentic feeling and independent moral judgment would corrupt even the best-designed institutions by using them to advance particular interests rather than the common good. Social transformation therefore required a two-stage process. First, the development of individuals capable of genuine virtue and social concern through practices like those that Rousseau had discovered in his solitary years, and second, the creation of institutions that would support rather than undermine these individual achievements. This approach placed greater responsibility on individuals for their own moral development, while also recognizing that individual efforts required supportive social environments to be effective on a larger scale. The contemporary relevance of Rousseau's exploration of solitude and nature contemplation is evident in growing recognition of the psychological and spiritual costs of constant social connectivity and technological mediation of experience. His insights about the need for periodic withdrawal from social pressures in order to maintain authentic self-knowledge anticipate current concerns about information overload, social media manipulation, and the loss of capacity for sustained reflection and contemplation. His practice of direct nature observation as a source of both knowledge and spiritual renewal anticipates contemporary interest in mindfulness practices, environmental consciousness, and the therapeutic value of outdoor experiences. Most importantly, his conviction that individual authenticity requires ongoing effort to distinguish between genuine personal responses and socially conditioned behaviours remains relevant for anyone seeking to maintain integrity and moral clarity in complex social environments that continue to reward conformity and artificial self-presentation over authentic self-expression. Part 20. Legacy and Modern Relevance, Rousseau's Enduring Questions. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's philosophical legacy extends far beyond the historical influence of his specific ideas to encompass a fundamental transformation in how human beings understand themselves, their relationships with others, and their possibilities for individual and social development. His central insight that human nature is not fixed, but rather emerges through historical and social processes that can either corrupt or enhance natural human capacities, continues to shape contemporary debates in psychology, anthropology, political science, and education. More importantly, the questions that Rousseau raised about the relationship between individual authenticity and social obligation, the conditions that make legitimate government possible, and the possibilities for human regeneration in the face of systemic corruption remain as urgent today as they were in the 18th century. Understanding Rousseau's enduring relevance requires examining how his fundamental insights apply to contemporary challenges, while recognizing the ways in which changed historical circumstances require new applications of his basic principles. The psychological dimensions of Rousseau's legacy are evident in the development of modern theories of human development that emphasize the social construction of identity and the importance of early childhood experiences in shaping adult personality. His recognition that human consciousness emerges through interaction with social and physical environments anticipated later developments in developmental psychology, social psychology, and cognitive science that have confirmed the fundamental plasticity of human nature. His analysis of how social environments can either support or undermine natural human capacities for empathy, creativity, and moral reasoning provides a foundation for understanding contemporary problems, ranging from educational failure and mental health issues to social violence and political apathy. The therapeutic and educational approaches that focus on creating supportive environments for natural development rather than trying to impose external control reflect Rousseau's fundamental insight that human problems usually result from environmental corruption rather than inherent individual defects. The political relevance of Rousseau's democratic theory is particularly evident in contemporary struggles with the apparent contradiction between democratic ideals and democratic practices in advanced industrial societies. His analysis of how extreme inequality makes genuine democratic participation impossible provides a framework for understanding why formal democratic institutions often fail to produce the responsive and accountable government that democratic theory promises. His warnings about the corrupting effects of representation and political parties help explain why many citizens feel alienated from political processes that claim to serve their interests while actually serving the interests of powerful elites. His emphasis on the need for active citizen participation in political decision-making anticipates contemporary interests in participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, and other reforms that seek to make democratic institutions more genuinely responsive to popular will. The economic dimensions of Rousseau's critique of property and inequality have gained new relevance in an era of growing wealth concentration and economic insecurity. His analysis of how private property creates artificial needs and competitive relationships that undermine both individual happiness and social solidarity provides insight into contemporary problems ranging from consumer culture and environmental destruction to political polarization and social fragmentation. His proposals for limiting property accumulation and ensuring broad distribution of economic resources anticipate contemporary discussions of wealth taxes, universal basic income, and other policies designed to prevent extreme inequality from undermining democratic institutions. His recognition that economic relationships shape consciousness and social relationships provides a foundation for understanding how changes in economic arrangements could contribute to broader social transformation. The educational implications of Rousseau's insights about natural development and authentic learning remain highly relevant to contemporary debates about educational reform and the role of technology in learning. His critique of education systems that prioritize standardized testing and competitive achievement over genuine understanding and personal development speaks directly to current concerns about the psychological costs of high-pressure educational environments. His emphasis on learning through direct experience and personal exploration rather than passive absorption of information anticipates contemporary interest in project-based learning, experiential education, and other approaches that engage students' natural curiosity and creativity. His recognition that education must address the whole person rather than just cognitive development provides a framework for understanding why purely academic approaches to education often fail to prepare students for the complex challenges of adult life. The cultural and technological challenges of contemporary life have created new forms of the social corruption that Rousseau identified in 18th-century civilized society. Social media platforms and digital communication technologies have created unprecedented opportunities for the kind of comparison-based thinking and artificial need creation that Rousseau associated with amour-propre. The constant availability of information and entertainment has made the kind of solitary reflection and contemplation that Rousseau saw as essential for authentic self-development increasingly difficult to achieve. The globalization of culture and commerce has created new forms of social fragmentation and identity confusion that make the development of genuine community and shared values more challenging than ever before. Yet contemporary technological and social developments have also created new possibilities for implementing some of Rousseau's democratic ideals in ways that were impossible in his own time. Digital communication technologies could potentially enable the kind of direct democratic participation that Rousseau advocated by making it possible for large populations to engage in genuine deliberation about public issues. Global communication networks could facilitate the sharing of experiences and insights across cultural and geographic boundaries in ways that could contribute to the development of more universal approaches to human problems. Scientific advances in psychology, neuroscience, and social science have provided new tools for understanding human development and social dynamics that could inform more effective approaches to education, social policy, and institutional design. The environmental challenges that face contemporary humanity have created new urgency for Rousseau's insights about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. His conviction that authentic human development required direct engagement with natural processes and cycles provides a foundation for understanding why environmental destruction creates not only material problems, but also psychological and spiritual costs that undermine human flourishing. His emphasis on the need to limit artificial needs and consumption patterns speaks directly to contemporary recognition that sustainable human development requires fundamental changes in economic systems and cultural values. His vision of small-scale, locally oriented communities that could maintain harmony with natural environments anticipates contemporary interest in sustainable development, bioregionalism, and other approaches that seek to reconcile human needs with ecological limits. The global dimensions of contemporary challenges require extensions of Rousseau's insights that go beyond the local and national contexts that he primarily considered. His principles of legitimate government and social justice need to be applied to international institutions and global governance systems that can address problems that transcend national boundaries. His analysis of how social environments shape individual development needs to be extended to understand how global cultural and economic systems affect human consciousness and social relationships. His vision of human regeneration through the recovery of natural goodness and the creation of supportive social institutions needs to be scaled up to address the challenges of creating a more just and sustainable global civilization. The ultimate significance of Rousseau's legacy lies not in any specific solutions that he proposed to the problems of his time, but rather in his fundamental reorientation of how human beings think about themselves and their possibilities for development. His conviction that human nature is malleable rather than fixed, that social problems result from environmental factors rather than inherent human defects, and that individual authenticity and social solidarity can be reconciled through proper institutional arrangements continues to inspire efforts to create more humane and just forms of social organization. His method of combining rigorous intellectual analysis with deep personal reflection provides a model for the kind of integrated approach to human problems that contemporary challenges require. Most importantly, his unwavering commitment to the possibility of human goodness and social regeneration, despite his clear-eyed recognition of the depth and persistence of social corruption, provides both inspiration and guidance for anyone who seeks to contribute to the ongoing human project of creating conditions for individual flourishing and collective well-being. The questions that Rousseau raised about what it means to be human, how authentic individuals can exist in social relationships, and what kinds of political and social arrangements can support, rather than corrupt human development, remain as challenging and as important today as they were when he first articulated them. Engaging seriously with these questions requires the same kind of intellectual courage and personal honesty that characterized Rousseau's own philosophical journey, but it also offers the possibility of insights and achievements that could contribute to the realization of human possibilities that Rousseau could only envision. His greatest gift to subsequent generations is not a set of answers to be accepted, but rather a set of questions to be lived, and a method of inquiry that combines the rigor of philosophical analysis with the authenticity of personal commitment to human flourishing. In this sense, Jean-Jacques Rousseau remains not a figure from the past, but a contemporary thinker whose work continues to challenge and inspire all who seek to understand and improve the human condition.